story. For generations, steel workers have forged not only steel, but also Britain's prosperity. From Scunthorpe to Sheffield, from Port Talbot to Teesside, steel communities have powered our industrial success, strengthened our economy, and contributed immeasurably to our national life. For those communities, steel is far more than an industry. It is a source of pride, identity, and opportunity. It is a way of life, built over generations through skill, dedication, and enterprise. But steel is not only about our past, it is fundamental to our future. Steel underpins our infrastructure, manufacturing base, energy networks, and transport system. It is essential to the homes we build, the railways we build, the power stations we build, and the defence capabilities on which our national security depends. My Lords, steel is therefore not merely another sector of the economy. It is a strategic national asset. Its future is central to our economic resilience, industrial strength, and our ability to deliver the growth and prosperity this country needs. My Lords, the global steel industry faces profound challenges. The volatile geopolitical climate, intensifying international competition, and significant global overcapacity have placed enormous pressure on steel producers worldwide. British producers face those challenges whilst also contending with energy costs that remain higher than most of the many of their international competitors. Recent events have highlighted the fragility of global supply chains. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities that many had assumed did not exist. Russia's invasion of Ukraine reminded us that economic and national security are inseparable. Increasing geopolitical uncertainty has underscored the importance of maintaining domestic industrial capability. The lesson, my Lord, is clear. A modern industrial nation cannot afford to lose the capability to produce the materials on which its economy and security depend. Without intervention, the United Kingdom faces a prospect of being the only G7 nation unable to produce virgin steel from raw materials within its borders. That would be, my Lord, more than an industrial failure. It would represent a strategic vulnerability. That is why in March this year, the government published its steel strategy, setting out a commitment to revitalize the steel sector, restore domestic production to sustainable levels, and secure the industry's long-term future. The strategy recognizes that the government has a vital role to play. It means tackling the drivers of high operating costs, including reducing industrial energy costs. It means maintaining a robust trade defence regime to protect British producers from unfair competition. It means working alongside industry to secure the investment needed to modernize and decarbonize steel production. And it means, my Lords, ensuring that where strategically important steel-making assets are at risk, government has the tools necessary to act decisively in the national interest. That brings me to the bill before the House today. This bill establishes a framework that enables the government, where necessary and justified by the public interest, to bring steel undertakings into public ownership. This is an enabling measure. It provides the government with the ability to intervene where strategic domestic steel-making capability is at risk and where such intervention is necessary to safeguard the national interest. As the Prime Minister has already made clear, the government is strongly minded to use these powers in relation to British Steel, subject, of course, to the public interest test set out in their legislation. My Lords, the circumstances surrounding British Steel and the Scunthorpe Steelworks are well known to this House. Scunthorpe is the last remaining primary steel-making capability in the United Kingdom. It directly employs approximately 2,700 highly skilled workers and supports many thousands of additional jobs throughout the wider supply chain. The government took decisive action last year under the Steel Industry Special Measures Act 2025 to prevent the premature and disorderly closure of the blast furnaces at Scunthorpe. I would like to place on record my gratitude to noble lords across the House for their constructive and responsible engagement with that legislation. I would also like to pay tribute to the parliamentary staff whose efforts enabled Parliament to respond swiftly to an urgent national challenge. The measures enacted last year served their immediate purpose. They prevented closure and ensured continued production. However, those powers were always intended to be temporary. Whilst they have enabled continued operation, they do not provide the flexibility required to undertake the longer-term restructuring, investment and modernization of the business now requires. As matters stand, the government believes that public ownership offers the most effective way to secure the company's future and to enable strategic decisions to be taken in the long-term interest of its business, its workforce and the nation. However, my lords, I want to emphasize that any decision to nationalize remains subject to the public interest test as set out in the bill. The government did not reach this position lightly. We engaged constructively and extensively with Jiangxi to pursue a commercial solution. Our clear preference was to secure the future of steelmaking through agreement rather than through intervention. However, despite extensive negotiations, it has proved impossible to reach an agreement that would represent a responsible and proportionate use of taxpayers' money. In those circumstances, the government concluded that legislation was necessary. My lords, some noble lords may reasonably ask whether nationalisation is the right answer. The government's response is straightforward. Nationalisation is not an ideological aim. It is not the first option either. It is a pragmatic tool available for use when the national interest requires it. The cost of losing our steelmaking capability would far outweigh the cost of preserving it. Once blast furnaces are extinguished, once supply chains disperse, and once specialist skills are lost, rebuilding those capabilities becomes almost extraordinarily difficult and expensive. Inaction carries consequences. Dependency carries risks. The loss of sovereign industrial capability carries costs that cannot be easily measured in purely financial terms. That is why governments around the world intervene to protect strategically important industries. Britain should be no different. We believe that British Steel can succeed. With the right leadership, investment and long-term strategy, the company can be transformed. We have already seen the success of public ownership in the case of Sheffield Forge Masters. Most recently, British Steel has secured important new contracts, including supplying rail infrastructure and supporting future energy projects. These are encouraging signs of the opportunities ahead. My lords, turning briefly to the detail of the bill, I fully recognise that it contains significant powers and that noble lords will wish to scrutinise them closely. That scrutiny is both expected and welcome. The government has consistently sought to ensure that the powers contained in the bill are proportionate, necessary, and appropriately constrained.
Point of information? The impact assessment doesn't have any figures in it.
Order. We do not do point of information on second readings.
I'll continue. That scrutiny is both expected and welcome. The government has consistently sought to ensure that the powers contained in the bill are proportionate, necessary, and appropriately constrained. In developing this legislation, we have drawn heavily on the framework established by the Banking Act 2009, adapting well-established precedents rather than creating entirely new mechanisms. The principal transfer powers are subject to a sunset clause and will expire 2 years after royal assent. This ensures they remain in force only for as long as necessary to achieve their intended purpose. The bill also provides for compensation arrangements when powers are exercised. Compensation will be assessed independently by a valuer appointed through an independent process. This ensures fairness, impartiality, and proper protection for affected parties. The government is committed to treating all investors fairly and consistently. Many of the technical provisions contained within the bill are designed to ensure that any transfer of ownership can be carried out smoothly and effectively. In practice, we are seeking through legislation to replicate many of the outcomes that would normally be achieved through a complex commercial transaction. That inevitably requires powers to address legal and operational issues arising from such transfers and to ensure continuity of operations. These powers are not novel. They follow established legislative precedent and are intended solely to ensure that the legislation's objectives can be achieved effectively. My Lords, this bill is ultimately about the kind of country we aspire to be. Do we believe that Britain should continue to produce steel upon which modern economies depend? Do we believe that strategic industries matter? Do we believe economic security, industrial resilience, and national security are worth safeguarding? Do we believe steel-making communities deserve a future? The government's answer to each of those questions is yes. The bill demonstrates a resolve to safeguard a strategically important industry. It demonstrates our commitment to safeguarding jobs, supporting communities, and securing Britain's industrial future. It demonstrates that this government is prepared to act decisively when the national interest demands it. Today, we have an opportunity to send a clear signal to steel workers, investors, industry, and the country that Parliament is committed to preserving and strengthening Britain's steel-making capability for generations to come. I look forward to the contributions of noble lords will make during this debate and to the constructive scrutiny I know this House will bring to the legislation. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time.
My Lords, may I start by congratulating the noble Lord the Minister on his appointment last Friday as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department of Business and Trade. He has a long-established and proven track record of success in business. And may I just say, I hope his voice will be heard loud and clear within government. I wish him well, and I hope he will emerge from our debates with his reputation enhanced. Now, at the outset of this debate, I want to make it clear that my party accepts that steel is a strategic industry. Steel helped to build our past, and I agree with the noble Lord the Minister that steel will shape our future. It matters to our national resilience, our defence capability, our manufacturing base, our construction sector, and to communities right across the country. Recognising the importance of steel is not, however, the same as accepting that nationalisation is the necessary answer. The central issue facing the sector is competitiveness, and the government has still to set out a credible plan to address just that. Last week, Al Carnes, who was then Minister for the Armed Forces, resigned from the government and has since argued that energy policy has to be treated as a matter of security. High energy costs, though, are making British steel less competitive globally. And the government's chosen path towards lower carbon production will dramatically increase the sector's reliance on electricity and will therefore require very substantial capital investment. The industry itself has warned that high electricity prices risk undermining its long-term plans to decarbonise. The government acknowledges that steel is vital to national security. If that is the case, then surely the energy policy upon which steel depends must also be judged through the lens of national security, resilience, and industrial capability. Now, the government came to office promising a £2.5 billion steel fund, a fund that was supposed to transform the sector, modernise production, support new technology, and crowd in private investment. But there is now a real risk that that money will be used not to transform British steel, but simply to plug the losses created by the government's failure to address the underlying causes of uncompetitiveness. If hundreds of millions of pounds are being spent merely to keep British steel operating day to day, and if still more liabilities are now to be brought into the public balance sheet through nationalisation, how much of that £2.5 billion will be left for genuine transformation? How much will remain available to support new technologies, energy efficiency improvements, and the investment needed to secure the industry's long-term future? This leads to a more fundamental question. Where does this end? Will British steel under public ownership be expected eventually to stand on its own 2 feet? Or will taxpayers be asked year after year to fund operating losses while ministers continue to promise help is just around the corner? So before Parliament grants these powers, surely it is reasonable to ask what the end state is. What is the exit strategy? And how the government intends to measure success beyond simply writing more and larger cheques. The government's own impact assessment makes clear that the costs of this bill will be substantial. These costs include the possibility of capital injections, working capital support, operating costs if the company remains loss-making, compensation, administrative overheads, and the expenditure inherent in establishing and running a government-owned company. So I do ask the Minister, what is the government's estimate of the total cost, and will Parliament be told that figure before the bill receives royal assent? We must also question the government's approach ensuring environmentally friendly steel. Ministers have chosen a pathway that the industry itself has warned will be more costly, more electricity intensive, and thus more difficult to finance. In the other place, the Secretary of State Peter Kyle said that the long-term future of the steel sector depends on both public and private investment. If the government's preferred model drives up costs and makes the UK less attractive than competitor countries not operating under the same net zero constraints, where is that private investment supposed to come from? Investors, of course, can choose where they deploy capital. And if the government makes steel production more expensive, more regulated, and more politically uncertain, they will look elsewhere. The government's own impact assessment on the 13th of May is very clear and explicit about the risk to investment. I quote in paragraph 75, "One potential impact is a chilling effect on investment, as investors may perceive an increased risk of government intervention. This could increase uncertainty for investors and therefore deter future investment in the UK steel sector. If investors perceive these risks as material, they could further undermine the recovery of the sector, putting jobs and capabilities at risk." End of quote. That is a remarkable admission from any government. There is also the wider trade risk that the government have not properly addressed. If British Steel is to be subject to constant and persistent subsidisation at the expense of the taxpayer, ministers must explain how they intend to ensure this remains compliant with the UK's international obligations. Prolonged state support, if not carefully structured, could risk challenge under WTO subsidy rules and could invite countervailing measures from trading partners. That would not be a theoretical concern. Other countries could impose countervailing duties, raise disputes, or just take other retaliatory action if they believe UK steel is being unfairly subsidised. Now, such action would not only harm British steel itself, it could also damage the wider UK steel sector and the downstream industries that rely on steel inputs, including automotive, aerospace, defence, construction and advanced manufacturing. So can the Minister therefore tell the House what assessment the government has made of the WTO implications of this bill and of any continuing public subsidy to British steel? Have ministers had discussions, any discussions with the World Trade Organization or with major trading partners about the proposed structure of support? What conversations do they intend to have before any transfer into public ownership takes place? On the issue of trade, my lords, I must also raise the significant concerns expressed by stakeholders across industry about the government's steel strategy and in particular its tariff policy. Now, the government appears to have conducted a partial U-turn. It seems we didn't need to wait 12 months for a formal review for ministers to discover that tariffs can be harmful. If only more than a century of economic history had already taught us that. The first point is one of parliamentary accountability. Any change to the government's steel tariff regime should be reported to Parliament first. So why are members of both houses having to learn through the media about possible changes? That's just not acceptable. And it gives the impression of a government making up policy in response to headlines rather than setting out a coherent and properly examined trade strategy. My lords, we've already seen the risks of retaliation. We've seen concerns in relation to the United States. We've seen questions raised in relation to India, including the possible implications for the trade deal. We now read of concerns about the European Union, with reports the Secretary of State has been to the EU to plead with the EU not to reduce tariff-free imports of British steel. Well, what did the government expect? If the UK chooses to escalate protectionist measures, it should not be surprised when trading partners respond in kind. Retaliation was not unforeseeable, it was predictable. We saw the European Union respond in precisely this way to President Trump's tariffs. Did the government really fail to assess that risk before introducing their own regime? Countermeasures, reduced market access, and increased uncertainty could all make it so much harder for UK producers to export and harder for investors to commit capital. At the same time, tariffs risk raising costs for downstream sectors that rely and depend on steel inputs. Metal forming, automotive, aerospace, construction, defence and advanced manufacturing among them. These sectors are central to growth, productivity and investment. If tariffs increase their costs, reduce their competitiveness, or force them to source elsewhere, then the government will have weakened the very industrial base they are claiming to be trying to strengthen. So I ask the Minister, what assessment has been made of the impact of the steel tariff regime on downstream manufacturers? What assessment has been made of possible or likely retaliation by trading partners? Why should British businesses have confidence in a strategy that appears to protect one part of the supply chain by imposing costs and risks on so many others? My lords, we just cannot ignore the wider business climate the government have created. I'm not going to go into detail about the Employment Rights Act 2025, but it will not stop me raising it because it's making the business environment less competitive and less conducive to investment. Combined with those increased national insurance contributions, endless reporting requirements and carbon taxes, the government is damaging the steel sector along with every other sector of the UK economy. For a steel sector already operating under intense global pressure, these additional costs affect hiring, investment, margins, productivity and the ability of British steelmakers to compete. In the light of the importance to our national security, the steel sector may be a special case, but that does not mean it is immune to the effects of wider government policy. There are so many questions that remain to be answered. At this point, His Majesty's opposition is far from convinced that nationalisation is the best option, or even the so-called least worst option. But we are eager to hear some, or better still, all of those questions answered as the bill progresses. My Lords, steel has shaped our nation's history. The challenge is now to secure a future for the industry that is internationally competitive, financially sustainable, and attractive to investors.
My Lords, I thank the noble Lord Leung for introducing this debate, and I too congratulate him on his very well-deserved appointment as a minister. This steel industry nationalisation bill is a government bill, and it's providing powers to nationalise any company involved in steel manufacturing where it's in the public interest. But we know the focus of the bill is the potential nationalisation of British Steel Limited, a company that is currently owned by the Chinese company Jinghe Group, and it's subject to ongoing government financial assistance, and it is still operating. And the government said in May last month that it's minded to nationalise the company. And this was cautiously welcomed, including by the local community in Scunthorpe, but there have been concerns raised about the significant cost and complexity of nationalisation. And of course, the Chinese government has urged the UK to act prudently and said it would protect Chinese business. The Conservative Party, as articulated by Lord Hunt just now very clearly, has set out its opposition to the bill and stated that it does not address the problems affecting the industry, which I will address in my speech. The company operates Jinghe Group, the only remaining blast furnace for steel in Scunthorpe. This is the country's only remaining production capacity for making virgin steel. If the blast furnaces are switched off, then it can be very difficult and costly to ever return them to operation. So they were preparing to close down the furnaces, and if you remember, my lords, last year Parliament was recalled, something that very rarely happens, and we passed emergency legislation, the Steel Industry Special Measures Act 2025, and that gave the Secretary of State the power to intervene in steel undertakings, and that is exactly what has happened. The result is the production plant, British Steel, is still producing, and the government has stated that it wants to now modernise and co-invest with the private sector. The Minister for Industry, Chris MacDonald, has set out his details and says government officials will continue to provide on-site support. And to date, the government has spent almost £500 million on working capital to support British Steel. Could the noble Lord the Minister confirm that? So when it comes to modernising and decarbonising, providing stability for workers and suppliers and customers, the government recognises it's going to require both public and private investment. Could the noble Lord the Minister confirm that? And then there's the impact assessment that was carried out for this proposal, and the impact assessment said that the Act of 2025 only provided short-term emergency powers and did not allow for the longer-term planning or investment required. And it said that the impact assessment that the powers could create fear amongst investors and put off UK investment in the sector, for example, concerns about government intervention. And it said this could undermine jobs and attempts to develop the sector. Would the Minister acknowledge this aspect? It also said the powers could have a positive impact, on the other hand, on supply chain confidence and reduce uncertainty, boosting investment and jobs in the sector, and it could have wider impacts on supporting and stabilising the economy and jobs. And overall, the impact assessment said that the socio-economic benefits were likely to outweigh the associated costs, but it said there would be post-implementation review within 5 years. My Lords, there is now the beginning of a clear and credible long-term plan for British Steel, with a low-carbon steelmaking as a priority. Now, this is an important point from a legal perspective. Peter Ware, who's a partner and head of government sector at the law firm Brown Jacobson, and I have to declare my interest, I have worked with this firm in my business, described this as one of the most potentially significant acts of state intervention in British industry in decades. He said it would raise substantial questions that will need careful navigation, including on compensation and the transfer of employees. Would the Minister acknowledge this? And of course, underlying sovereignty concerns are losing the Scunthorpe furnaces would, as the Noble Lord the Minister said in his opening speech, leave the UK as the only G7 country unable to make steel from raw materials dependent on imports for a material central to defence and infrastructure. And as co-chair of the India All-Party Parliamentary Group, the UK, of course, signed the CETA with India, its FTA, last year in July at Chequers, with implementation due any time soon. And the pitch to the Indian the bill legislates discretionary power to seize a foreign-owned steelmaker. Now, this is scary to any potential investor, and it sends the opposite signal to the Vision 3035 partnership at the worst possible moment when we're about to implement the CETA. And to do with India, we've got Tata, India's flagship UK industrial investor in the UK, with Jaguar Land Rover, and of course the £1.25 billion investment in Port Talbot, the electric arc furnace, which the government has supported with £500 million of grants to save 5,000 jobs. And this bill defines steel undertaking generically. Can the Minister confirm that the intention of the government are to do with Scunthorpe and not to do with the Tata? Having secured Tata's £1 billion commitment, the UK is actually handing itself a power to expropriate that same asset in the public interest, and that is quite scary. And when it comes to compensation, this needs to be taken to account. The valuing of the business, it may award nil compensation. This is something the government could do. So Tata's entire transition rests on government co-investment. So if the state can seize the asset and value it, but for the support of the UK government, then the inbound investment is worth little or nothing. And this is really very scary to a country we've just signed a free trade agreement with, a country where we're hoping to double our bilateral trade from nearly £50 billion to £100 billion by 2030. And Peter Ware of Brown Jacobson once again said the compensation question is particularly complex, with the government having already committed over £400 million in working capital. Jinge's scope to claim substantial compensation may be limited, but legal challenges under bilateral investment treaties or domestic property rights principles cannot be ruled out. Would the Minister acknowledge this? And Siobhan Halliburton, the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, and I chair the International Chamber of Commerce UK, and we're the regional coordinators for Europe. Siobhan Halliburton sits on the board of the ICC UK. She warned of significant financial and logistical problems from planned tariff changes, cautioning that revised quotas and tariffs risked economic damage in key supply chains for sectors such as car making, aerospace, and medical technology. Could the Noble Lord the Minister please clarify that the rumours in the press that are circulating that India may reduce tariff concessions for the UK due to steel tariffs, jeopardising the FTA that we have signed, and that this FTA should be separated from any issues to do with steel? That would be really reassuring to hear. And then on top of this, we have the backdrop of US tariffs and the UK's high energy costs. And the government announced its much-delayed steel strategy, focused on reworking trade quotas designed to protect steelmakers from a glut of Chinese imports. But before that, the Tata Steel point, I don't want to miss this point, has broken ground with the £500 million of government backing. It's going to be a pivotal moment in UK steelmaking in its future, which is expected to cut the site's carbon emissions by 90%, and that is thanks to the £500 million helped by the government, saving 5,000 jobs. My lords, if you talk to Tata Steel, they say it is absolutely paramount that it should be a distinguishing fact of how they operate and what they're doing versus what's happening with UK Steel in Scunthorpe. So we need clarification of these powers that they're not going to be implemented to a company like Tata. And there's another point. A challenging opportunity is domestic demand. The UK steel industry now only supplies 32% of UK's overall steel demand. Would the government commit that there should be a minimum threshold of 30% minimum has to be from domestically produced steel? And on top of this, and this is a point that Noble Lord Hunt has mentioned, the UK's energy prices, which are some of the highest in the world, certainly the highest in Europe. If I give you some facts, that UK steel producers face an average electricity price of £66 per megawatt hour, compared with Germany at 50, France at 43. So we pay up to 50% higher than our main competitors right at our doorstep in Europe. And on top of that, steel is a highly traded commodity. And as chair of the ICC UK and Regional Court of Europe, our expertise is in trade, and our competitors in Europe have successfully accessed government grant funding of 50% and above for major operational changes. China's steel subsidies are more than 10 times higher than those of OECD countries and more than 5 times those of non-OECD economies. Steel subsidies in non-OECD countries are 42% higher in terms of cash grants, 11 times higher with respect to below-market borrowings than in OECD countries. So how do we create a level playing field when we are facing this sort of competition worldwide? On the other hand, there are great opportunities. The renewable energy infrastructure also presents a huge opportunity for the UK steel market. One report shows that just the offshore wind pipeline will require 25 million tonnes of steel by 2050, a potential value of £21 billion to the UK steel market over the coming decades, which will be great for our British steel industry. And this again reinforces that we need to have this 30% minimum threshold. So when it comes to paying more than 50% more for our electricity than our counterparts in France and Germany, and when it comes to facing excess steel-making capacity, the gap between global capacity and crude steel production in 2023 was estimated at 543 million tonnes. That is 70 times the size of the UK market. Exports from China this year are expected to reach 100 million tonnes, the highest in 2016, when the last steel crisis saw several steel plants closing and thousands of jobs lost around steel-making countries around the world, including the UK. And on top of that, you've got the US tariffs, the effect of the US tariffs. And Tata Steel, for example, exports about 170,000 tonnes of products to the US. These products are not made in the US. It can only come from us, so they need what we produce. So, my lords, before I conclude, there is no question we cannot compete on costs with producers in China and across Asian markets. They have lower environmental regulations, cheaper carbon-intensive energy and labour costs. It's very difficult. And on top of that, UK steel producers face higher network charges, despite the government's recent announcement of 60% exemption for charges starting in April last year. Germany produce 90% exemption. France, 80%. So we could do more. Can the government do more to help our industry? And the last 2 points are research and development and innovation. Tata Steel, for example, spends around 10 to 15 million pounds in R&D, and they collaborate with universities such as Warwick and Swansea, Cambridge, Sheffield, Cardiff, Imperial College. We must encourage more of this research and development between our industry and universities. And skills. We need core capabilities in engineering and metallurgy and safety and sustainability and leadership and advanced digital and green skills and AI. So, my lords, I conclude. I have the privilege of chairing the Manufacturing Commission, which is the research arm of the Manufacturing APPG. And although manufacturing was 30% of GDP in the 1970s and now gone down to less than 10% of GDP, the UK is still the 6th largest economy in the world and the 11th largest manufacturer in the world in absolute terms, and most importantly, high-quality manufacturing that we're proud of. And steel is a vital part of our manufacturing industry. We must do all that we can to ensure that our steel industry continues to flourish and prosper.
My Lords, can I also offer my warm congratulations to my noble friend the Minister on his appointment. I strongly welcome this bill for the simple reason that our country must have a sovereign capability to make steel. And I commend the government for acting swiftly. Taking powers to nationalise in the public interest is an essential tool of a modern industrial policy. We've done it before. In 2009, with cross-party support, similar powers were taken to stabilise the banking and finance industry. If we can bail out bankers, we can certainly support our steel workers. Steel is a vital part of our economy, as we've heard. Critical infrastructure such as roads, bridges, defence capability, our hospitals and schools, housing and wind turbines all rely on steel. And some would add to that list Wembley Stadium, built with British steel. In today's world, we can't afford to leave ourselves at the mercy of China dumping cheap steel on the global market, or the United States playing a capricious game on tariffs. Nor can manufacturing deploy on supply chains left vulnerable by wars made in Moscow or Washington. So the bill is essential for our security too. Many other advanced economies recognise the value of a mixed economy and the important role that state intervention and ownership can play. Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Spain, in China, India already provide major state aid to their steel industries. The state can intervene not just to correct market failures, but to accelerate industrial success. It can both protect and grow firms of strategic importance and, for good measure, lift skills, living standards and whole communities. The opposition once recognised that too. In 1971, a Conservative government led by Ted Heath, admittedly somewhat reluctantly, nationalised a strategically important firm that was on the brink of bankruptcy. It was called Rolls-Royce. Some mounted the same arguments against nationalisation back then that we hear from some quarters today, that it was too expensive or that government shouldn't bail out so-called lame ducks. Of course, history records that under state ownership, Rolls-Royce produced a new generation of engines that were a huge commercial success. It was only 16 years later that Rolls-Royce was sold off, alongside a good deal of the nation's family silver, including, of course, the national grid. Over subsequent years, bill payers and taxpayers have paid a high price for that 1980s dogma of privatisation. Now the steel industry is at a crossroads. According to More in Common polling last year, the public think that the government should take state control of the wider steel industry. Over half of the public support this, with only 13% opposing. Support for public ownership of British steel is even higher. Roy Rickus, chair of the National Trade Union Steel Coordinating Committee, and a former steel worker himself, in fact, I think also the son of a steel worker, he backs this bill. Gareth Stace, Director General of the Trade Association UK Steel, strongly backs it too. They agree that without support, our steel industry risks falling further behind international competitors, but with state backing, British steel can become a global leader once again. And let's be clear, we owe our steel workforce. Their vital work is hard and it can be dangerous. So we owe them respect for their skills and resilience. But most of all, we owe them respect for their sheer determination to see a successful and a sustainable future for their industry and for their communities. I would welcome my noble friend, the Minister's views on the following in conclusion. Firstly, I agree, we need to deliver competitive energy prices. So can the Minister tell us what additional support there will be for energy-intensive industries, including progress being made to speed up and scale up grid connections? Secondly, we must match the ambition of other countries' investments in green steel production and ensure a just transition for workers. Can the Minister update us on discussions with the steel industry and trade unions to develop the Just Transition Plan? And does the Minister agree that all technological options need to be on the table? Thirdly, can the Minister comment on the need to introduce robust climate measures to protect us from dirty steel imports and progress to mandate the procurement of UK-made steel for defence, energy and major infrastructure projects, including a clear forward pipeline to encourage long-term investment? Finally, in this House, I have previously asked about the government's assessment of the impact of the UK manufacturing of the EU Industrial Accelerator Act. I would add to that questions about the impact on UK steel of the European Union's plans to cut tariff-free quotas by 47%, to double tariffs from 25% to 50%, and to impose melt and pour requirements. I would be very grateful if the Minister could provide an urgent update on the reset negotiations and other discussions with the EU on these specific matters, either now or by letter.
My Lords, I congratulate the Minister on his appointment. And I'm also very grateful to the Minister for his honest account of this legislation when he made it very clear that it is very likely that the strong powers in this legislation will be used sometime soon to fully nationalise the Scunthorpe Works. That, I think, makes it even more curious that the government he represents has given us an impact assessment with no numbers in at all, and no account of what a nationalisation of the Scunthorpe Works would look like, what impact it would have on the public budgets, what impact, as my noble friend Lord Hunt said, it would have on the 2.5 billion allocated for steel as a whole, and no account of how it would be a transfer of money we thought allocated for capital investment and modernisation in creating something new to the purpose of paying losses on a very old plant whose future is very uncertain. During this debate over the course of this bill, I hope we can get some numbers from the government. I think both Houses of Parliament, when the emergency legislation went through a year ago, understood the government wasn't then in a position to produce numbers, but at that point in those debates, in both Houses, strong voices said there must be a business plan. There must be budgets, and we were told at that stage that these would be forthcoming in relatively short order, but we await them. We still have a menu with no prices. We still have a lack of information about what the business plan of a nationalised Scunthorpe would look like, just as we've travelled for a year with a Scunthorpe that is run by the state and paid for by the state but not owned by the state, making enormous losses, which according to the press have been running at £1.3 million a day, without any explanation of how long this might go on, when those green shoots the Minister reports will actually translate into real cash, how much steel this plant needs to sell and at what kind of prices before it can have a positive margin, or before it can maybe halve the negative margin which it has been running at for all too long. Indeed, we were told at the point when the state took on these mighty obligations that under the previous Chinese owners it had been losing about 700,000 a day, and so if the more recent press stories are right, the losses have clearly been considerably worse over the last year. Now, I understand that the Minister can't firmly say they are definitely nationalising because they put in this public interest test, and they obviously haven't yet applied the test to any project to nationalise which they are currently planning. But reading how wide the public interest test allows the government to be in order to satisfy itself, I don't think it's any actual prevention of nationalisation of Scunthorpe. I'm sure they're quite clever enough to come up with a plan which is well within the details of the public interest test, widely drawn as it is in this piece of legislation. So I don't think that is a reason for not giving us proper figures. I think it would also be good, over the course of this bill's debates, if we could hear a more honest statement to the workforce of Scunthorpe. Because the government says two different things. It tells the press and the rest of us, and we're very relieved to hear it, they've saved the jobs. But then the government still seems to be wedded to a net zero strategy, which says that all blast furnaces of the Scunthorpe type have to close, and they're the only two left, and to be replaced by electric arc furnaces. So if that is still the plan, we need to be told that honestly, and the workforce needs to be told that, because of course there will be a very big reduction in the numbers of people working should they switch from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces. In the case of Scunthorpe, as the Welsh steel industry discovered when the previous government went on that journey, carried on by this government, to replace those blast furnaces with electric arc furnaces. Ministers should have a personal interest in wishing to get beneath the numbers and work out how much it's going to cost, not just because of pressures on public budgets and the need to assess this against alternative ways of spending the money, but also because we read that when the initial transfer of the liabilities and the running of the plant was made to the state, the senior civil servants apparently said to the Secretary of State and ministers that they were not able at that point to sign off that this was value for money, and they were not able to sign off that it was definitely going to be a policy which was going to work. And I think they weren't saying it definitely wouldn't. I think they were saying they didn't have enough time and it would require a lot of very detailed work and consultation, and ministers used their right to issue a direction to the civil service to say that we think the public interest is such that this is urgent, and so we're going to ignore the absence of sign-off on value for money and on the efficacy of the policy because it's worth a shot, and we ministers will take responsibility. I understand that, but because they've taken that responsibility, the ministers are under more of a personal duty to come to this House and to the other place with proper budgets and proper business plans to show that there will be value for money as they go this course. Indeed, I think we need a year's audited statement on what's happened so far with all that money passing to a Chinese-owned business, which the state largely controls, but where it doesn't own the assets. I think it would be good as well to be updated on where the government has got to in negotiating with the Chinese owners. I think it's tragic that we haven't had a deal with the Chinese owners, and it may be the Chinese fault. I understand that there are two sides in any negotiation. But when I looked from the outside, just using public sources, at what was on offer when the state moved in a year ago, I thought as a rough rule of thumb, if the state said to the Chinese owners, we will take full responsibility for the workforce and their future payments, so we save you all the redundancy payments you would have had to have made if you'd carried out your closure, that the state would take on the land and buildings in the state they were in, probably with many environmental obligations and costs of clean-up, and that would have been another relief for the Chinese authorities, the company, because otherwise they could be liable for having to clean up the site after they had closed it. And in return, the government should have said, you definitely keep all the debts you've incurred during your unsuccessful period of management, And the value of your share and your land and plant we would put at £1 to complete the transaction. Some people thought I was being a bit generous. But that, I think, was the sort of shape of a deal that one might have been talking about. Now, I believe, according to press comment, the government's been thinking about 100 million of compensation for the liabilities it's absorbing in order to also obtain the plant and the land in its current state. And we read in the press that the Chinese say, no, they want $1 billion for this transfer of the freehold and the shares, which would seem to me to be extremely excessive in the circumstances, and I would fully support the government pushing back very hard on that, and if necessary, defending themselves in court if they can't get a deal. But it would be in everybody's interest if a deal could be reached, and it would be helped to get to that deal if we had a published statement of the likely business plan for an enterprise now in public control and maybe soon to be in public ownership, because that would also help create a mood for the negotiations with the Chinese, because I fear that business plan, certainly for the last year and probably for the next year or so, would produce an awful lot of red ink, and it would be the background to explaining to the Chinese why the idea that they might walk away with 100 million or $1 billion is for the birds, because they've presided over a heavily loss-making business and they were unable to find a way to make it work. So they were actually thinking of incurring massive costs of closure as the alternative to carry on with a very high rate of losses. Now, like all the other speakers in this debate, I too think we want a proud steel industry again in Britain, as we were used to having over many decades. And I also myself think that there is a case for keeping a virgin steel manufacture capability, as well as a lot of electric arc recycling steel capability. And that would require a study of how much longer one could carry on with these two blast furnaces, which the state is probably about to own quite soon, and what would be a sort of deep or long-term maintenance schedule if it is thought that they can carry on, because these are quite aging plants. But that would perhaps be a better option than having to think about how you found an investor to want to establish new virgin steel making capability in our country. And what is very clear in the wider debate of the Minister and the Shadow Minister's opening remarks is that we're not going to have that opportunity of inward investment or domestically financed investment or the city financing through private equity or new equity issued through the AIM market or whatever, a steel-making capability in this country. All the time our energy prices are sky high. And we've heard unfavourable comparisons in a previous good speech compared with European competitors, but of course they are not the main threat. And Asia and America has energy prices considerably lower, and in the case of the United States of America, a first world competitor in many fields with a much stronger economy than the European one, their electricity prices are 1/4 of the prices that industry in Britain has to pay before any subsidy. The government is following a bizarre policy towards energy because it puts on massive carbon and emissions taxes. It puts on all sorts of other taxes if we dare to produce any of the energy ourselves, or otherwise we have to pay other people's heavy oil and gas taxes as we import so much. And then it realizes that that produces energy prices that mean the loss of jobs, the mass closure of industry. And we've seen refineries go, and we've seen bits of the oil industry go, and we've seen petrochemicals go, and we've seen a lot of our steel industry go, and a lot of our ceramics industry. So then it says, well, why don't we offer a little bit back by way of subsidy to discount the very expensive energy prices we've got with these very high taxes imposed on the energy. This is a very bad way of doing it. You get the worst of all possible worlds. You deter investment because the energy prices are too high. You don't give enough back in subsidy to make the businesses competitive, so they still close. and you're left with a situation where you're deindustrializing so that your import bill for goods goes through the roof, your import bill for energy goes through the roof because of the bad mistakes made in the energy policy, and that is why the UK is struggling so much. So please, ministers, for your own sakes, do some sums, find some numbers, work out what the business case is going to look like, interrogate your managers, find out what you need to do to help them to sell more steel. Because unless you can sell more Scunthorpe steel, it's no point in pumping money in. You won't end up saving the jobs. And please tell your workforce whether you're serious about saving these jobs and you really want to carry on with blast furnaces, or whether your net zero preoccupations means that their jobs are doomed anyway.
My Lords, I congratulate my noble friend Lord Leong both on his ministerial appointment and for his opening speech, and give full support to the government for doing its best to protect and modernise a strategic industry. An industry that suffered from past failures to adapt and from short-termism and lack of courage by successive governments. It wasn't the workers who let the side down, or the communities who depended on them. Tough jobs and tough people. My brother-in-law, Don, worked in the steel industry in Scunthorpe for most of his working life. I was there to celebrate his 90th birthday 2 years ago, and he's still soldiering on. As I said, tough people. We could spend a lot of time analysing how we got to this position, how much steel is stuck in the Strait of Hormuz, tariff imposition by the USA, whether Europe is doing any better. We could pore over the comments by the Chinese Commerce Ministry when it called on our government to respect the wishes of firms and market principles and avoid the abuse of administrative coercive measures. And we could compare that with the Chinese state aid and anti-competitiveness practices. We could score points on all of these things, together with overcapacity, cost, and complexity of the issues, but none of it would preserve a strategic industry or save a single job. Clearly, issues such as parliamentary scrutiny, sunset clauses, and regular reports to Parliament are important and can be discussed more thoroughly at committee stage. This bill is a signal that the government is ready to take action if it is in the public interest to do so, because at present we are not in control of our steel industry. We do not have sovereignty. Why is the public interest not more closely defined in the bill? Well, I accept the explanation that we cannot forecast the circumstances, whether it will be defence or national security, or the construction, maintenance and operation of critical infrastructure in the United Kingdom, which companies might be the first to impact on us, as Lord Billimoria has asked quite understandably, given his connections with the Indian industries. Included in this must be where a steel company attempts to take a decision which might have a detrimental national implication, whatever the name of the company, in my view. I do not believe any minister would choose to be in this position today. There are no guarantees of success and no political kudos. It's about taking tough decisions to keep a national lifeline and try to protect our future security. The government recognise that blast furnace production will need to continue in the immediate future and I'm sure it welcomes the remarks by the previous speaker, Lord Redwood, on that. And that a managed transition is vital to monitoring supply. It accepts the need for public and private investment to modernise. That has been repeated several times in the debate in the other place. Opponents of the bill have cited the cost of employees and energy costs. Now, workers in the UK earn an average of £40,000 a year and represent only 13 to 22% of total costs, depending on operating a primary basic oxygen furnace or a recycled electric arc furnace. So I would argue that this is far from a labour-intensive industry. However, as has been said by previous speakers, energy costs are a different matter altogether and represent the highest in Europe. I understand that the British Industrial Competitive Scheme is being developed as part of the UK's industrial strategy and could save a substantial amount in energy costs, but it's not due to be launched until April next year. Is there any chance that this could be brought forward? I would like to ask the Noble Lord the Minister if he has any more information on the development of that policy. Germany, Spain and France have already intervened on energy costs in their steel industries. As we are now, we cannot provide a long-term control or stability. We must safeguard supply chain resilience for defence, critical national infrastructure and major programmes, as stated in the impact assessment. The government needs to have the ability to respond quickly and effectively, and I commend the bill to the House.
My Lords, I congratulate the Noble Lord the Minister on his promotion and thank him for his very clear opening statement. My Lords, the problem we've got today is that we're looking at a bill which is important in its own right, but it's really only one part, obviously, of a much bigger problem, which is, can we sustain a steel industry at all in this country? And if so, how? Now, I'm not quite such a fan of the government's March steel strategy as the Noble Lord the Minister is. And the problem is that what one thinks of this bill really depends on what one thinks of this broader strategy and how viable it is. Now, I do sympathise with the government's difficulties, even though they are, in part at least, not wholly self-generated. And even somebody as economically liberal as me recognises we're hardly operating in a free market environment in this area, and some sort of government sort of steering hand is needed. We all have an interest in maintaining a viable steel industry in Britain. After all, it's the design that's crucial. So I want to set out three contextual problems, if you like, before talking about how we might find a way forward here. The first problem is one that's been alluded to before, the fact that there isn't any genuine market in steel globally. We know about the huge amount of structural overcapacity worldwide, the Chinese subsidies, and the reaction, the wave of tariffs, quotas, anti-dumping measures, and so on and so forth that has spread across the industrialised world. And there's no sign that's going to change anytime soon. And in that context, I do understand the government's resort to tariffs. I certainly don't like them, but I think it's unreasonable to exclude them as a weapon. I do think they could be better targeted on particular kinds of steel, stronger rules of origin, perhaps bigger TRQs for reliable suppliers. And I wonder, maybe the Noble Lord the Minister could say whether the government has considered this or might consider it in the future as a way of reducing the downstream effect on our own producers. Second problem is the need for resilience and the national security issues that go with that. And that means maintaining a necessary sovereign capacity, as other noble lords have said. The question is, what does that sovereign capacity actually mean? The UK currently consumes about 12 million tonnes of steel a year. It's going up slightly. Domestic production is about 30% of that, and the government says it wants to go up to 50%. It's never going to be 100%. So sovereign capacity doesn't mean producing everything you consume. It's about having and defining the capabilities you can't afford to lose and the supply chains that you can't afford to depend on. And I think my assessment, others will have different views, my view is that the main capabilities we should be focusing on are the defence-grade plate forging specialist alloys that are made in Sheffield, broadly, and the government is committing to that. Stockpiling, reliable contracts for the upstream supply chains, another part of this. And then third, rail critical infrastructure products currently made at Scunthorpe, but unprofitably. Now, the first of those three categories is largely state-guided and in part state-owned. The second, stockpiling, the government has said nothing at all about this. And on the third, on Scunthorpe, the government hasn't, I don't think, really been clear about what the national security or resilient case for keeping Scunthorpe going really is. The noble Lord the Minister mentioned that it was about maintaining the ability to produce steel from scratch, from raw iron. But of course an EAF plant with a DRI plant can do that as well, and that may well be the direction of travel. It's not in some particular resilience in the upstream supply chain either. We no longer make coking coal, after all, in the UK. So we have to import that anyway to keep Scunthorpe going. As far as I can see, the only real case is transitional, to keep the UK as a main supplier to the rail industry while, if this is the intention, the new electric arc furnace facilities are built at Scunthorpe. And I don't know whether this is the government's case or what mix of these things really is the government's thinking on Scunthorpe. And perhaps, again, the noble Lord the Minister could give us a bit more detail on that. Third problem. If we are envisaging a modernised steel industry of some kind in this country and capacity of specific types for specific purposes, can it be done profitably over the long term? Is it viable? Now, I think our answer to that is it can. We can see it done in the US, in the mini-mill industry, and indeed elsewhere. In Turkey, for example, has a profitable steel industry based on EAF plants. Now, maybe this points to a UK model that is something like specialist capability for defence in Sheffield, 2 or 3 EAF clusters, perhaps including Scunthorpe, and this question of a DRI plant, which is touched on in the government strategy, but not really brought to a conclusion. Now, perhaps, I don't know, we could all agree to this as a viable destination. The problem is, how do you get there? As a destination, it depends on a cost and a business environment that currently doesn't exist. Electricity is super expensive and getting worse. The business environment is poor and getting worse. And as a transition, it involves encouraging somehow investment into this poor business environment, or else the government coming up with the money itself. And this is why we have the problem that this bill encapsulates. We're heading for a destination that's probably unviable, however desirable it may be, in current conditions without massive government help. And this is the problem with rushing to nationalise Scunthorpe without thinking it through properly. So where does this leave us? I think in the circumstances there clearly is a case for temporary nationalisation of Scunthorpe on certain conditions. Temporary public ownership may be justified, and we wait to hear from the noble Lord the Minister on this, because closure might remove the UK's primary iron capability overnight with no clear succession plan. But the problem is, as we know, nationalisation always sets up terrible perverse incentives and poor management, and that's why temporariness is really important. There must be a way out, there must be a viable end point. And I think it is reasonable to ask for something clearer on these conditions if we're going to proceed satisfactorily. And I give notice, I'll probably put down some amendments to this effect. We need three things, I think. We need a clear exit strategy for Scunthorpe. The blast furnace run-out date, if there is one, an EAF commissioning date, if there is one, and a target for return to the private sector. And without this, Scunthorpe just risks becoming British Leyland, a permanent loss making ward of the state, where all the incentives are just to put in more money and hope things turn up better. Impossible to close and impossible to fix either. Second condition for a viable industry, and unfortunately it's very far from being fulfilled, is electricity and energy prices and a business environment that support a viable industry. And we know the problem with electricity prices, and it has been said that the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme exists and will hold down those prices, but of course it is only cross-subsidy itself. And we are supposed to believe, and the Secretary of State for Energy has said, that our great net zero project is going to bring prices down in the future. So why do we need the cross-subsidy if that is really the case? I do think there is a real problem here with the strategy. And it's not just me that's saying this, plenty of people are saying it. Dieter Helm, who is a pretty neutral commentator on this subject, and certainly has supported net zero in the past. I wrote, and I quote what he wrote on the 3rd of June, "The industrial consequences of the government's energy policy have been dire. High electricity prices have contributed to the closure of Grangemouth, the closure of the Exxon refinery in Scotland, one of the Hull refineries, the closure of most of the steel industry, the closure of the fertiliser and fiberglass industries, severe problems for pottery and glass making, car manufacturers back to 1950s levels. There's devastation amongst SMEs, unfunded welfare spending has increased the cost of capital. Energy policy has reduced economic growth, not increased it." And that is the problem. We are building a steel industry, we hope, into that environment, and it's not clear to me how it is going to survive in those circumstances. So to conclude, my lords, I think the third thing we need is a proper strategy for the industry as a whole, and not, we need a plan for Scunthorpe, but we need something broader. What is the end point? Is there going to be a DRI plant or not? Does the government recognise the need for stockpiling of hard-to-source EAF kit and scrap? Does it recognise the need for strategic stockpiles of defence, plate, billets, HBI, and so on and so forth? And the problem we have, to return to where we started, is that the March strategy only covers about half the ground. It commits on Port Talbot funding, it commits on expanding Forge Masters, and it commits on one or two other things. But it is unclear on Scunthorpe, subject before us today. It's non-committal on DRI. It's silent on stockpiling. It says very little or nothing about whether the future industry can be expanded further if we need to upgrade our defence effort. And above all, it doesn't tell us what the hierarchy of objectives is. What is the government's choice framework? When national security clashes with profitability, what is most important? When employment clashes with modernisation, do we protect jobs or do we fund the transition? When net zero clashes with the industrial base, do we change the plans or continue the charge of the Light Brigade to industrial suicide? This needs to be clear if it is a strategy. So I would like to think the March strategy is just interim. I don't know, but perhaps the Minister could say whether any thinking has been done on this broader approach and whether a broader strategy is needed. My lords, Britain isn't going to get back to a world of free trade in steel. It's not going to appear anytime soon, but it can have a steel industry that's smaller, smarter, sovereign in the things that matter, and capable of paying its own way. The problem is that putting so much of this in the hands of a government relies on a government that is capable of strategizing for industries and running them. And history suggests governments are not very good at those things. So I think we're right to be sceptical about the approach. We're right to ask for more information. And perhaps in winding up, the Noble Lord the Minister could start giving us some of that.
My Lords, when the government took powers to take control of British Steel's operations last year, they were clear that they had no intention of nationalising it. Now, nationalisation is the name of the game. This pivot has nothing to do with the government's failure to reach an agreement with the owners of British Steel. The weakness of the Prime Minister has driven it. In his desperate attempt at another reset after last month's local government elections, the Prime Minister reached for the socialist playbook of nationalisation. This was aimed at placating the trade unions and the left wing of his party, and they duly reacted with joy. There is no plan for British Steel other than to take it into national ownership. The government have not said how much this socialist adventure will cost British taxpayers. The impact assessment is very long on words and has no financial analysis, as my noble friend Lord Redwood has said. Parliament is being asked to buy a pig in a poke. Nationalisation is not the answer to the root causes of unprofitability in the steel industry, as many have already said today. Like all British businesses, high unemployment costs and taxes are an issue, but it's the ruinous level of the cost of electricity which is killing our energy-intensive industries. Now, I am not proud of the former government's net zero policies, which made so much of British industry uncompetitive, but the current government's policies are very much worse. Industrial electricity prices are amongst the highest in the Western world, as we have already heard, and the reliefs already announced but not yet enacted barely scratch the surface of the problem. This is where the government's attention should be, not this bill. My Lords, as a matter of principle, I oppose state ownership of businesses. I spent much of my professional working life working first on nationalised industries while in state ownership and later on privatising them. And I am absolutely clear that the state was a terrible owner of commercial businesses. There were many downsides of state ownership. Instead of the informed judgments of capital markets, nationalised industries were overseen by civil servants who had little or no experience of business. Key decisions, such as those on investment, were made by ministers for reasons which were political rather than economic. And trade unions typically called many of the shots and prioritised job protection over commercial success. The result was massive inefficiency, which only privatisation could unlock. Now, one of the biggest problems that faced nationalised industries in the past, and will surely face British Steel if it is nationalised, is financial pressure from the Treasury. Nationalised industries are rightly classified to the public sector, and so their borrowing scores as public sector debt. It does not matter whether the debt is provided via the Treasury or whether it is borrowed from the market. It is all public sector debt, and so there is no escaping the Treasury's interest in keeping public borrowing in check. We know that the UK's public debt is not far short of 100% of GDP, a long way from its pre-financial crisis norm of no more than 40%. And the risks are all on the downside. If the powers under this bill are exercised, we can expect public sector debt to rise as British Steel sucks in more and more cash. The Treasury are unlikely simply to nod in approval. Now, my Lords, while I do not favour nationalisation, one of my main problems with this bill is that it is not a nationalisation bill. I remember what nationalisation legislation looks like, and it is not like this bill. When businesses were nationalised in the past, there was a clear legislative formula. The government controlled all key appointments, such as the governing board and the chief executive. The government had wide powers of direction, which were generally not used, but acted as a reminder to the nationalised industry that the government called the shots. The government had powers over borrowing for the reasons I have just mentioned. And there were also arrangements for parliamentary accountability, such as the laying of annual reports and accounts. There is none of that in this bill. Instead, the government make great play of basing this bill on legislation designed to deal with the fallout from the financial services sector after the global financial crisis. That legislation was never conceived in terms of creating nationalised banks and building societies. It was used as a mechanism to sell any saleable bits of the failed financial institutions and winding down the rest of it. Its use as a precedent for the nationalisation of British Steel is a category error. Now, the 2008 Banking Special Provisions Act lasted for only 1 year, and it allowed the government to deal with a very small number of failures like Northern Rock, which could not find a private sector buyer. The 2009 Banking Act, which set up a permanent resolution regime for failing banks and building societies, has only been used once, and that was for a very small building society. I cannot think of a less suitable legislative foundation for a nationalised industry. My Lords, while the government seem to have no idea about the future of British Steel and what role, if any, the private sector might have, they have been clear that the purpose of this bill is nationalisation. And if that is the case, a completely different bill is needed to give the government the correct powers and levers. Now, if the government do intend state ownership to be temporary, which I would applaud, though it would doubtless upset their left wing, they need to make this clear on the face of the bill. For example, there should be regular reports to Parliament on the progress made in returning British Steel to the private sector. There should be a duty on the Secretary of State to seek all reasonable ways of encouraging private sector ownership, as well as an explicit duty to ensure that the cost to the public purse is minimised. My Lords, I was pretty shocked by the lack of financial analysis accompanying the bill, and so I have just 2 questions that I ask the Minister to answer when he winds up. First, do the government accept that the debt of British Steel will be classified as public sector debt from the day that the government exercised the power to acquire it under this bill? And secondly, will the government commit to giving Parliament a full analysis of the impact on the public finances when they choose to exercise this power and seek parliamentary approval?
Can I begin by congratulating my noble friend Lord Leon on his debut in this debate, and it was a very good one as well, and we look forward to similar contributions in the future. I welcome the bill. I welcome it because, first of all, there's been almost unanimity in this debate from your lordships regarding the significance of steel and the importance of having steel as a critical and vital part of our economy. And that's a very important starter. How we do it, I suspect, will be the cause of lots of debates in committee and report stage. But it's vital to our construction, to our defence, to our engineering. It's vital because of the uncertain world that we now live in. a world of tariffs and of wars and of presidents who are unpredictable and of dictators all around the world. And unless we have our own steel industry, and the G7 meets as we debate this in Evian, each of those countries around that table have their own steel industry. But it's also vital, and it hasn't been touched upon too much in this debate so far, but I will, on the significance of the communities around the steel industry. And you would expect a Welshman to refer to the Welsh steel industry as part of our life in Wales. It's in our blood. I come from a family of miners and steelworkers. I represented a constituency in the other place which was a steel-making constituency. In Blaenavon, the Gilchrist-Thomas process was invented, which transformed steelmaking in the 19th century. I had in the constituency a stainless steelwork, which for generations, which was hugely important to our communities. And as an aside, before I entered politics, I taught in a college in Ebervale at the time when the steelworks was almost completely closed. And the impact of that closure in a one industry town was devastating. And that is why, in terms of British Steel and Scunthorpe, it's not simply about the significance of keeping our steel industry, but ensuring that our communities are healthy and intact. And I'd like to point to the House that, of course, we are only talking about approximately half of steelmaking coming from British Steel. The other half comes from Wales, from an industry which is not nationalised. And in the great Port Talbot steelworks, which is now changing over from the blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, in that particular steelworks, the whole of the steelmaking capacity of Tata in Wales is where steel is produced. And it's quite interesting that in this 50% of steelmaking, the industry is not nationalised. It's a working partnership between, on the one hand, the government, by which I mean two governments, government in Cardiff and a government here in Westminster, and between the company itself. The deal, which was struck only days before the general election, meant that approximately £1.3 billion was to be invested in Port Talbot. £500 million of that came from the then Conservative government. This government has honoured it, and indeed has gone further by giving about £120 million to retraining, and also by ensuring that procurement rules are changed so that British companies must use British steel. And to that end, 5,000 jobs are to be maintained in Port Talbot. So as welcome as this bill is, we have to see it in the context. It's not the only part of the picture. It's only half of it. But the questions I'd like to ask my noble friend, the Minister, is regarding Port Talbot, which this month suffered a severe fire on its site and is undergoing some difficulties with regard to that, but also that there are problems with the supply of electricity. And I very much take the points that have been made regarding the cost of electricity. I think that is hugely important. We can't ignore it as a Labour government. We have to look at it very seriously. And secondly, there are planning issues which have been faced by the company in Port Talbot. These, I would have thought, can be overcome if my noble friend liaised with the Secretary for Wales and obviously with the new Welsh Government as well. I think at the end of the day, all of us understand that we cannot be without a British steel industry. Nothing is going to be easy with regard to this. No easy solution to it. But this is at least a start. It's the right thing to do, and it's the British thing to do.
My Lords, this enabling bill paves the way for possible nationalisation of steel companies with particular emphasis on British Steel, currently owned by the China-based Jingyi Group. This nationalisation may or may not happen. We've got to wait and see. The bill allows government to transfer the shares or property of a steel company into public ownership where doing so is in the public interest. The concept of public interest is inevitably highly contested and competing meanings can be advanced. It would be helpful to have the Minister's explanation of the detailed conditions that would actually satisfy the public interest test and possibly enable us to discuss maybe public ownership of other industries as well. The Minister's explanation would help to dissolve uncertainty for workers, suppliers and local communities. Prolonged delay in nationalisation would actually increase the cost to public purse, as since April 2025, the government has already been incurring significant costs to keep the Scunthorpe plant going. I support the public ownership of steel as it is a crucial input for so many industries. The Scunthorpe plant is the last UK plant producing virgin steel, which is essential for construction of buildings, railways, and critical hardware like submarine hulls and aircraft landing gear. Loss of the plant will leave the UK as the only G7 country without the capacity to produce virgin steel. A large number of direct and indirect jobs depend on the plant. Nationalisation and expansion of the steel industry would help with to expand our industrial base. The bill actually raises lots of questions about the government strategy. It is rescuing England-based British Steel, but allow the Port Talbot blast furnaces in Wales to be extinguished. People in Scotland still haven't forgotten the government's failure to rescue the Grangemouth refinery. Can the Minister answer the charge of being England-centric? Can the Minister assure the House that once the Scunthorpe plant is nationalised, it would not be reprivatised by a Labour government? This bill also throws up other inconsistencies in the government policies. Nationalisation of steel and rail passenger services is apparently in the public interest, but the same is rejected for water, even though water companies exploit people, dump raw sewage in rivers, and are destroying human lives, marine life, and biodiversity. Some 120,000 people a year are dying in fuel poverty, but there is no attempt to nationalise energy. Is it that the government is prioritising corporate interests over the lives of the people? Part 2 of the bill establishes a framework for possible compensation for nationalisation. I assume that this would eventually require another bill. Can the Minister clarify the position? As British Steel is financially insolvent and is finding very, very difficult to survive, and its assets probably don't have any alternative use value, chances are that any compensation offered for it would need to be fairly low. Any framework for compensation must recoup around £500 million or so spent by the government to keep the Scunthorpe plant going. The real value of all subsidies and grants must be recovered. The Jingyi site in Scunthorpe is the second largest single site source of carbon emissions in the UK. It accounts for approximately 2.2% of the UK's total carbon footprint. Surely the government would insist that Jingyi make good the environmental damage before it exits the steel industry. If not, it would be helpful to know why the government would not insist on that. As expected, the opposition benches are focused on the possible cost of nationalisation and its impact on the national debt. That is really a one-sided argument, because through nationalisation, governments also acquire assets of the enterprise in question. They enhance economic resilience and improve supply chain security. The tendency of the ONS is to show net liabilities of publicly owned entities and ignore the assets. It does that for Network Rail, where its liabilities are shown in the national debt, but assets are completely ignored. That practice needs to change. If changed, the ONS calculation must net off nationalised British Steel liability against its assets, which would result in a very small change to any national debt calculation. Can the Minister clarify the position and indicate whether how we measure the national debt would actually be changed? The high cost of energy is a major obstacle, as many noble lords have already indicated. It puts steel making and other industries at a competitive disadvantage. The high cost is an issue all across for households as well. We know in April the government extended what it called a British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme, which reduces energy bills by about 25% for 10,000 companies deemed to be heavy users of energy. That scheme kicks off in April 2027, though discounts would be backdated to 2026. This scheme is funded by the public purse and is therefore likely to be temporary. In any case, it does not help small businesses, farmers, and others who are totally excluded from it. A bright future for steel making and British industry requires permanent reform of energy costs. That would require decoupling of the price of gas-produced electricity from the rest, moving all levies to general taxation, and cuts in profit margins of energy companies. This in turn would require scrutiny of the way Ofgem calculates weighted average cost of capital and all the assumptions that are used to generate those numbers. Noble Lords earlier mentioned many countries which have a competitive advantage in energy production. Countries such as France, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, India, China were mentioned. What they did not mention was that in these countries, a significant part of the energy production is state-owned. So freed from the need to generate profits, they are able to simply break even, taking 1 year with another, and therefore offer their industry a competitive advantage and also lower rates of inflation. So public ownership of energy must not be a taboo for the UK. It could give the government more economic policy options and help to address competitiveness of our industries. I'll look forward to hearing the Minister's replies.
Thank you for allowing me to speak in the gap, and may I congratulate the Noble Lord the Minister on his appointment and his opening statement. As negotiations to resolve are still being negotiated, the bill does not immediately nationalise until public ownership test is met. But years of underinvestment in our steel industry has resulted in being neglected for investment, and uncertainty lingers for many skilled Scunthorpe steel workers and those employed in the supply chain. When only last year the House was recalled last April for emergency state intervention, whilst at the same time we witnessed a cliff-edge shortage when the Chinese owners halted new orders for coking coal and iron pellets, causing a critical threat of the last blast furnaces going cold, and has since then cost the government over 1.3 million every day to keep the furnaces running. For the future to sustain steelmaking to continue in Scunthorpe will be through transition to 2 new electric arc furnaces, but will take several years due to limited preparation including secure grid connection. So the question posed is, how will government secure the stability for the plant be achieved in the short to medium term? For steel having to compete on an unfair level playing field with having the highest energy costs in Europe is one of the greatest barriers to competitiveness and viability for future investment. These costs must be reduced. With ongoing support of the steel business, government must ensure that Bess and Anne are part of that transition. They are proud Scunthorpe queens of virgin steel. They are hungry to keep burning and cannot be left to run cold, as they nearly did, as I said earlier, last April, but they need further investment now. These are initial concerns surrounding the scale of the UK carbon border adjustment mechanism, while we are still importing nearly 70% of our steel requirements. This too must be reduced for procurement and to look how future UK contracts are managed. We must not and cannot be the only G7 nation without the ability to make primary virgin steel. And we must not forget that steel provides vital material for our national infrastructure and economic growth, from defence to renewable energy, including supporting our highly skilled specialist workers who work in the production of our own steel making. As government puts forward this proposal to nationalise a steel company in the short term, it can make its own decisions and for the future may have the opportunity to include new investors or new owners. Above all, my lords, all our steel sector needs certainty for our dedicated workforce and contractors, and for future investments for our industry stretching across the country. The future has to be UK steel first for our prosperity. Thank you.
My Lords, may I very briefly, in the gap, flag up my support and that of Plaid Cymru for the bill in its general objectives, though we have reservations on some of the detail which I hope I can pursue at later stages. May I also wish the Minister very well in his new duties. My Lords, before entering Parliament, I worked for two major steel-using companies, Ford Motor Company at Dagenham and Hoover Washing Machines at Merthyr Tydfil. Steel was a basic ingredient of both products, and when I started working, steel employed over 100,000 workers in Wales. The danger then was of such manufacturing processes becoming vulnerable to new techniques or being undercut by overseas manufacturers. Modernisation was essential. The third quarter of the 20th century saw the nationalisation, the denationalisation, the renationalisation, and then in the 80s the privatisation of steel, hardly conducive to attracting the investment needed to modernise that industry. And at that time, as now, steel had a strategic importance in terms of defence policy, and that surely is the real backdrop to this bill. I accept that the UK requires, for defence purposes, a steel industry which isn't vulnerable to commercial or strategic decisions taken by overseas industrialists or governments, or the whims of financial markets. And if steel has that level of strategic importance, then all the eggs should not be in one basket. We need 2 or 3 centres at least, where the capacity, technology and skills are available, and which aren't vulnerable to being undermined by physical or cyber attacks. It's in that context that I view this bill that's before us today, and I have in mind the implications for iron and steel manufacture at Port Talbot. The main reservations which Plaid Cymru has about the bill is whether or not the powers will be used to safeguard the steel industry in Wales. There is widespread belief that the steel industry at Port Talbot has not been treated on an equal basis with that at Scunthorpe. Now, we don't claim that Port Talbot should have preferential treatment, but neither should Scunthorpe. Both are needed, and both should be developed in a manner that avoids strategic, economic or defence needs being limited to one location. That would be nothing less than strategic myopia and a blunder of monumental dimensions. So the assurance which I seek is that this bill is not the prelude to building up Scunthorpe at the expense of Port Talbot. I will clearly seek to clarify whether the public interest test applies equally to Port Talbot as it does to Scunthorpe, and whether equivalent resources will be available to both Port Talbot and Scunthorpe. Both plants need to be as effective, productive and resilient as each other. While Port Talbot is the major plant in Wales, other steel locations such as Shotton and Llanwern should be developed appropriately. A diversity of capacity, technology and experience is needed to ensure a steel industry which responds to commercial and strategic needs. We may also want to probe at later stages as to how the public interest is defined. Defence and strategic considerations are clearly within such definition, but the public interest may extend much further, as the noble Lord Murphy implied in his comments a few moments ago. There must also be a provision requiring the UK Government to work closely with devolved governments in implementing the bill. I shall be grateful for whatever assurances the noble Lord the Minister can give me, and I look forward to his response.
My Lords, I'd like to join the chorus welcoming the noble Lord Leong to his new ministerial role. Not only has he got the new role, but he's got it in time to steward this bill through your Lordship's House, and indeed the commercial payments bill as well. What a time to be alive, my Lords. As we've heard, around Easter 2005, the government pressed the emergency button, pulled us into Parliament on a Saturday, and as a result acquired the powers to make decisions regarding the Scunthorpe blast furnaces and avoid its owners running it down. Subsequent events supported the government's haste in that movement. In order to avoid this bill becoming a hybrid bill, it carefully avoids Scunthorpe. But I very much doubt that we would have been having this bill were Scunthorpe not an issue. So it sits there like a Banquo's ghost, and clearly the government is having to press buttons in order to take control from the Chinese owners. My Lords, so you don't have to, I reread my speech of last year, and to be honest, I could have copied and pasted some of the large parts of it. On the Saturday debate, I noted that the steel industry's problems did not start a couple of years ago. They are systemic and have been there for a long time. And in that regard, I noted the hubris of the Conservative spokespeople, and the noble Lord Hunt did not let me down today, that there are huge responsibilities that go back a long way on this industry. It isn't 2 years' work. I asked how steel fits into the carbon emissions route to net zero. I questioned the path to an electric arc conversion, and in giving support for that bill, I said that there needed to be an overarching steel strategy. Well, we've reached the privatisation stage, and to be honest, I'm quite surprised it's taken that long. The Scunthorpe plant's been hemorrhaging public money for over a year, and the government has clearly been arm wrestling with the owners, Jingji. Since 2025, the government published a steel strategy which has billions of pounds attached to it. So in this context, this bill is part of a very high stakes exercise that the government is seeking to run. And so it is important that there is sufficient scrutiny, both in your Lordship's House and in the other end, on every move that follows this bill, should it be passed. Now, I'm going to use this speech just to set the scene, and there are 4 broad issues of concern, and we've heard lots of them in different ways: national security, economic resilience, modernisation, and of course jobs and communities. The justification for protecting the steel industry has always been that it is a strategic asset. Not least it supports defence, critical infrastructure, wider national resilience, and of course our advanced manufacturing industries. For many years, a contrary commercial argument has preached that most of what we need is available on the open market and is usually cheaper as a result. Now, clearly, the proponents that frame this bill as protecting the country's ability to make essential materials at home, and it turns on the question of sovereignty and readiness. And my Lords, living in the world we live in now, Liberal Democrats side with this sovereignty argument. that going on the world market is no longer a safe option to take us forward. But I would remind your lordships that none of what we discuss today can be taken in isolation of the steel tariff regime and the implementation of CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, nor can success be achieved without the provision of low-cost green energy. Now, I'm going to talk about the first two and leave energy costs for another day. Clearly, that's not because they're not important, it's because they don't directly relate to this bill. Now, on the subject of tariffs, I thank the Minister for his letter clarifying some of the issues, but I would question the spirit of his reply, which seems to say that everything is okay in terms of the way the tariffs are going to be pitched. The word from steel users is that it most certainly is not. We're being told that the measures due to come in force just 2 weeks away, the 1st of July, are likely to have a materially damaging impact on downstream manufacturers, with immediate implications, of course, for competitiveness, investment and jobs. For steel users where there's no direct domestic sourcing alternatives, materials must be imported. However, we are being told that the current commodity code structure is too broad, and really reflecting some of the issues that the Noble Lord Frost reflected to in his speech. There seems to be a need for a more subtle coding process in the focusing of tariffs. Because as a result, if essential items that cannot be domestically sourced are captured within the tariff regime, this is going to have a dire effect on the industrial users. And with tariff-free quotas being reduced by around 60% and a 50% tariff applied beyond those limits, businesses that need those kinds of steel are effectively being taxed on critical inputs and with no ability to substitute domestic products if they're not being made. The Department for Business and Trade has received proposals from the industry, I think, to remove certain commodity codes or move certain commodity codes, make amendment on quota sources and utilise authorised use schemes. And I would urge the Minister both to respond to this and to go back to the Department and make sure that it is fully cooperating with different elements of the supply chain in order to make sure the unintended consequence, and I believe it's an unintended consequence, does not come back. Now, of course, most of the steel that is imported is coming from the EU, and negotiations between the UK government and the European Union, therefore, are critical on this element. If those negotiations reach successful fulfilment, then many elements that are causing problems around tariffs will be eliminated. But of course, we're homing in on a very tight corner here, because the 1st of July, as I've already pointed out, is 2 weeks away, and we may have a period, we've got an interim period between agreement with the EU and the implementation of these tariffs. So I think it would be useful to hear from the Minister how the timing and phasing of these could be achieved, and whether putting relief in for a further period until such time as the EU negotiations are concluded would be a better way of giving some certainty for our businesses. We will, of course, be coming back to this in Grand Committee, but that'll be another week gone. So I think it'll be important to find out where you're going. Fundamentally, and this is obvious, but I do want to make the point, it's not the manufacture of steel that is strategic, it's its use. And ring-fencing steel production using tariffs, if that then creates higher costs for our businesses, we're missing the point. Because it's the use, it's how we make stuff that is actually important. And we don't just need a secure industry that produces strategic materials, we need it to be cost effective. And that's one element, of course, of the economic resilience point. The government has said that its actions are meant to avoid a sudden halt in production and provide stability, while longer-term options are considered. My Lords, the nub of this statement is what are the longer-term options. And although we have a steel strategy, I think there is an awful lot of work for the government to do to flesh out how what it sees the future of our industry. And a key element of that is whether or not it sees Scunthorpe continuing to have blast furnaces or converting to electric arc, and that was broached by the lady speaking just now. Now, we've had some discussion in the past, the Minister and I, about the substitutability and whether there is a strategic need to keep blast furnace capacity, to keep virgin iron production in the United Kingdom. And I would like to hear from the dispatch box that if we are going to go to an all-electric arc provision within the United Kingdom, that we will be able to maintain all of those strategic needs for steel in this country as it stands now, not some future provision where electric arc can be honed and tuned. Can we now, with the knowledge we have now, deliver the steel that we want? So moving on, the aim is to make the industry investable. And really, I'd like the Minister to engage a little to explain on how this is achieved. For example, every location will come with huge environmental legacy. And ultimately, there will need to be remediation. And usually it is the owners of those businesses who have to fund that remediation. Every location has important pensions commitments. The bill appears to deal with pensions liability, I think only indirectly. And I presume that once taken into public ownership, ministers will have to manage the company's wider obligations, including pensions, through the rescue or transfer process. So perhaps the Minister can expand on that. But both these factors affect investability. Can the Minister specifically explain its attitude in any nationalisation to environmental and pension liabilities when it comes to looking for investors? Will subsequent investors in the nationalised steel have the opportunity to invest clean of past liabilities, or will they be investing in a business that retains those liabilities? Again, I think this will be a topic I will pursue in committee. The government has said that its aim is not just to preserve the status quo, but to create a modern, competitive steel sector. And once again, this legislation is merely a route to explore future options. It's still not the final answer. The government has rightfully emphasised the importance of steel plants for jobs and communities. My Lords, nationalisation could preserve many of these jobs, but does the Minister recognise that when it comes to creating that modern, competitive, investable steel sector, there may well be fewer jobs going forward in the future? So how will the government move to prepare now in those communities so that they can be made stronger and be able to absorb any changes that happen to the employment patterns in their area? The other important part of this bill is the inclusion of the public interest test. And the Noble Lord Sicker did my work for me in terms of laying out some of the puts and takes that go into that. But the point that I have is that there will be tension between the real value of Scunthorpe, whether it's a positive or a negative value, and our relations with the Chinese government. So in that case, how does the balance of interest, of public interest, actually lie? How does the government view this? My Lords, last year we were asked to approve an emergency stopgap to save Scunthorpe. This bill is couched in wider terms, devoid of detail and laden with executive powers that could very well leave taxpayers exposed to huge costs and liabilities. That vagueness means it's unclear how it will actually protect jobs and what the steel future will look like. Because of this, my colleagues in the Commons tabled amendments seeking to give Parliament more oversight into the developing stages of this paving legislation. We agree that it's important to get on with this, but only with the necessary parliamentary controls, and we will be retabling those amendments. And as a final passing point, really echoing the point that Lord Bill Moria and Lord Wigley said, nothing about this bill should be used to put Tata and Port Talbot in an unfair disadvantage as their transformation reaches fruition. To conclude, in practice, the UK steel strategy's success will depend on whether the prevailing energy costs, the implementation of CBAM, huge public sector investment, the imposition of procurement and demand measures, and the introduction of import tariffs and tighter controls are enough to make domestic production commercially viable. This is a huge task, and I think we have to work very closely together in order to achieve it. It is a mission that we want to succeed, and we support this bill with some provisions, and I look forward to Grand Committee.
My Lords, can I join in the general approval of the Minister's promotion? I wish him well, and I'm delighted to face off against somebody who's got considerable business experience. I'm also grateful to all noble Lords who've contributed to this important debate. It's always a pleasure to follow the noble Lord Fox, who of course when he was talking about hubris was slightly selective in his times. I think the steel industry has had systemic issues for a couple of decades. And there was a Liberal Democrat business secretary, I think, for at least 5 of those years. However, apart from that, I agreed with much of what he said. And there was also a great deal of agreement in the House about the strategic importance generally of steel, which is welcome. And British steel, of course, which matters to Scunthorpe, to jobs, to rail, to construction, to manufacturing, to defence, and generally to our national resilience, as many others have noticed. Nor do we deny that the government may have had to act in April 2025 to prevent an immediate and disorderly closure of the blast furnaces. But the central question remains, and it runs through this debate, and it's not really whether steel matters, it's whether nationalisation is a serious strategy for making British steel viable. On that question, the government have still not provided convincing answers. As my noble friend Baroness Noakes noted, nationalisation, we were told, was not the government's original plan. So when the emergency steel industry special measures legislation was brought before Parliament last year, the then Secretary of State Jonathan Reynolds told the Commons that the bill, and I quote, does not transfer ownership to the government, end quote. He said that the government's aspiration remained a co-investment agreement with a private sector partner to secure a long-term transformation. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that the Minister will say that private investment remains the goal. And indeed, the Minister in the other place, Chris MacDonald, also said as much in a written statement on the 14th of July. But where is the plan to achieve that? Where is the timetable? Where is the private partner? Where is the route back to commercial viability? Now, the noble lady, Baroness O'Grady, referred to the halcyon days of the 1970s, when state ownership worked so well that I have clear recollections of doing my homework by candlelight. My Lords, the fact is, in the 1970s, when the Labour government last ran British Steel, the taxpayer was forced to carry staggering losses. And we do worry that the danger is now that we repeat the same mistake, not by solving the underlying problem, but by moving it from the company's balance sheet to the public balance sheet. The central barrier is not ownership. The central barrier is competitiveness. I think every speaker in this debate has referred to high energy costs. It is the cost now of doing business more generally in Britain. It's the regulatory and taxation environment that makes heavy industry harder here than it is in competitive countries. Yet the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero appears more interested in driving forward an ideological net zero agenda than in bringing industrial energy prices down dramatically. My Lords, I can't help thinking that with his messianic zeal, he's doing more damage to the government's growth agenda than anyone else in Britain. Instead of cutting bills, cutting taxes, abolishing the UK carbon border adjustment mechanism, and giving energy-intensive industries a fighting chance, the government seems preoccupied with regulating ever more aspects of economic life, from factories to household heating products. My Lords, we recognise that there has been a long-standing and serious problem with Jingyi. We also recognise that there may now be legal proceedings, and I do not ask the Minister to prejudice the government's position in litigation, but there are matters in which the House is entitled to clarity. So could I please ask the Minister, can he confirm whether Jingyi has asserted that from the date on which the government assumed control of British Steel, on the 12th of April 2025, neither Jingyi nor any company in the Jingyi Group has any continuing obligation to British Steel? Can the Minister confirm whether Jingyi intends to disaggregate British Steel from Jingyi Steel UK Limited and remove assets, liabilities and other British Steel related items from its own balance sheet? If that is correct, what is the government's assessment of the solvency position of British Steel itself? My Lords, if British Steel is continuing to trade only because the government, directly or indirectly, is underpinning its working capital, does the Minister accept that this raises very serious questions about the public accounts treatment of the support that has been advanced since April 2025? Does it still make sense to treat that support as recoverable debt? If the company cannot pay it without further taxpayer support, does the government now accept that if British Steel continues to trade, the taxpayer may have to assume responsibility not merely for the working capital, but for accumulated non-cash losses, balance sheet liabilities and forward obligations? Will the Minister also address the reported intercompany debt position? Jingyi has been reported as quantifying outstanding British Steel debt to different Jingyi counterparties at hundreds of millions of pounds. If the government acquire all the shares in British Steel and the company is not placed into insolvent liquidation, will the government become responsible for those liabilities? Will the taxpayer be assuming the full built-up losses since 12th of April 2025, losing the prospect of clawing back earlier support and taking responsibility for future liabilities, including eventual decommissioning of the blast furnaces? And my Lords, the Noble Lord the Minister, when opening, talked about the premature closure of the blast furnaces, which SISMA, or the Special Industry Steel Act, was supposed to prevent. Has the government commissioned a study of how much life these blast furnaces have left in them? And I think it's important to ask that question and to know the answer, because of course that is going to have a material impact on the decommissioning costs as and when they arise. My Lords, can the Minister confirm whether our maths is correct on this? The National Audit Office has said that support for British Steel is expected to reach £615 million by June 2026, while Jingyi is reportedly seeking compensation of more than £1 billion. Once potential compensation, operating support, working capital, administrative costs and future capital investment are taken together, is the taxpayer exposure now approaching £2 billion or potentially even higher? And if that figure is wrong, will the Minister set out the government's current estimate of the total cost to the taxpayer, including any liabilities that may come onto the government balance sheet on day one of nationalisation? I have to say as well to the Noble Lord Sicker that if he thinks the assets, which are a couple of 70-year-old blast furnaces, are likely to offset the liabilities, I've got a couple of hats I'll eat. My Lord, as my noble friend Lord Hunt of the Wirral set out so clearly, the government came to office promising a £2.5 billion steel fund, a fund that was supposed to transform the sector, modernise production, support new technology and crowd in private investment. Yet there's now a real risk that this money will be consumed not by transformation but by rescue, as my noble friend Lord Redwood pointed out. Money that should have been used to modernise the sector, to lower energy costs, to support new technology and to bring in private capital may instead be used simply to keep one loss-making business afloat. And that leads to the question, which has been asked repeatedly in this debate, where does this end? Will British Steel under public ownership be eventually expected to stand on its own 2 feet, or will taxpayers be asked year after year to fund operating losses while ministers promise that a solution is just around the corner? The bill says that the Secretary of State may exercise transfer powers only when he considers it necessary in the public interest. And I do think that there were some very good questions asked by the Noble Lord Seeker and the Noble Lord Fox on what is the public interest and how it's defined. Looking forward to the Noble Lord the Minister's answers on those. Now, the government says that the public interest will include considerations of national security, the economy and critical infrastructure. But could ministers be any more vague when they refer to the economic interests of the United Kingdom? Will taxpayer funding be limited or capped, or are ministers asking Parliament to approve an open-ended commitment, and will the government be required to show that they have made every reasonable effort to secure private sector investment before nationalisation proceeds? My Lords, it was an uncomfortable and indeed somewhat ironic to witness that representatives of the Chinese ownership and indeed the Chinese Communist Party lecturing the United Kingdom about abiding by market principles, although I do note that the noble lady Baroness Donaghy pointed out to the irony of that as well. But the fact is that the government must still consider the signal that they are sending to international investors. If ministers seize control and fail to secure a commercial settlement and then proceed to nationalisation without a clear compensation, exit or investment plan, How does that make Britain look to the next investor considering committing capital to the strategic industry here? My Lords, we also cannot ignore the wider business climate that the government have created. As my noble friend Lord Hunt and others have made clear, the elephant in the room is the Employment Rights Act of 2025. Now, I know that ministers are tired of hearing about it, but we're not going to stop raising it because it is helping to make the business environment less competitive and less investable. Combined with the increase in national insurance contributions, endless reporting requirements and carbon taxes, the government are piling costs upon costs and burden upon burden on the very industries they claim to want to support. So for a steel sector that's already operating under intense global pressure, those additional costs are not abstract. They affect hiring, investment, margins, productivity and the ability of British steelmakers to compete. At precisely the moment when steel needs flexibility, lower costs and greater productivity, the government are increasing the cost of hiring and handing still more leverage to trade unions. It's no surprise that the unions have called for steel nationalisation. The concern is that the government have given in to them. How will ministers ensure that a national security asset is not left at the mercy of industrial action? The government have removed important strike safeguards. So what protections will exist to ensure continuity of supply for defence, infrastructure and critical manufacturing if British Steel is brought into public ownership? Are we seriously to place a strategic industrial asset under state control and then leave it vulnerable to the same union pressure that the government have chosen to empower elsewhere? The government have had more than enough time to tackle the underlying problems: uncompetitive energy prices, rising employment costs, higher national insurance, excessive regulation, and the burdens of the Employment Rights Act, and of course the net zero policy that too often ignores the realities of energy-intensive industry. The steel sector has been operating on a tight margin for years, and nationalisation does not make any of those problems disappear. So in closing, can I ask the Minister to answer the central question: what is the total expected cost to the taxpayer? What is the plan for private investment? What is the timetable for restoring commercial viability? What is the exit strategy? And what specific measures will the government take to reduce the costs that made British Steel uncompetitive in the first place? My Lords, without answers to those questions, this bill is not a serious strategy for steel. It is a costly exercise in papering over the cracks with nationalisation. So we urge the government to come forward with a serious plan, one that lowers costs, attracts investment, protects taxpayers, and secures the long-term future of the British steel industry.
My Lords, let me begin by thanking all noble Lords who have contributed to this excellent, thoughtful and wide-ranging debate, and also for their very kind messages on my appointment. My Lords, I was trying to count the number of questions asked, but I gave up after 45. So I will try to respond to as many noble Lords as possible within my allocated time. If I'm unable to address every point raised, especially some relating to costs and technical issues, I will ask my officials to review Hansard carefully, write to noble Lords accordingly, and place copies of those responses in the library of the House. My Lords, the quality of the debate in your Lordship's House is often remarked upon, and today's proceedings have once again demonstrated the immense expertise, experience and commitment members bring to issues of national importance. There have been contributions from across the House and from all sides of the debate. Whilst there may be differences of opinion about the means, I believe there is a remarkable degree of consensus about the end, namely that the United Kingdom should continue to have a strong and sustainable steel industry. That consensus matters. My Lords, many noble Lords spoke of the challenges facing the sector, and government recognises those challenges. These challenges are real and significant. They are unlikely to disappear in the foreseeable future. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has made clear, we are determined to revitalise the UK steel sector, restore domestic production to sustainable levels, and ensure and secure the industry's long-term role in supporting economic growth. That means reducing industrial costs, which I will come back to later. It means supporting investment, it means modernising production, and it means also creating the conditions for a competitive and sustainable industry. And it means ensuring that government has the tools necessary to act when strategic, important steel-making capability is at risk. And it is about ensuring the future generations continue to benefit from the British steel industry capable of supporting our economy and security. My Lords, let me address the question posed by the Noble Lord Sharp first. With regards to the question about the company Jingzhe and the ownership of British Steel, while we are strongly minded to use the powers in the bill to nationalise the company, no decision has been made and taken, and any decision will be subject to consideration of the public interest test. The government has been providing ongoing funding to British Steel, as most Noble Lords know, under the Special Measures Act, and we are publishing regular updates to Parliament detailing this funding. These funding arrangements will be set out in the Department's upcoming annual reports and accounts, and we are committed to transparency on this issue. My Lords, let me address the points raised by Noble Lord Hunt and Sharp, and I have the greatest respect for both Noble Lords. My Lords, blaming workers' rights for unemployment is a caustic distortion of the real issue. It substitutes ideology for evidence and seeks to conveniently scapegoat rather than confronting the structural changes that genuinely hold back employment. Fair pay and basic protections are not obstacles to growth. They are the foundations of a stable, productive labour market. Businesses that invest in their workforce through training, progression and decent terms tend to achieve stronger retention, higher productivity and better long-term performance. My Lords, responsible capitalism reduces the need for state intervention, but where short-termism prevails and workers are treated as a cost to be squeezed rather than an asset to be developed, government has a legitimate role in setting fair minimum payments. My Lords, let me address the issues on tariffs referred to by Lord Hunt, Lord Billy-Murray, Lord Murphy and Lord Fox. My Lords, the government support free and fair trade, but trade must be fair. Free trade does not mean surrendering British jobs to subsidize foreign competitors. It means ensuring that British firms compete on a level playing field, not with one hand tied behind their backs. British steel producers should not be expected to compete with heavily subsidized imports, dumb products, or unfair trading practices that distort markets and undermine domestic production. Every major steel-producing nation takes steps to protect its industry from unfair competition, and the United Kingdom cannot be the only country to leave its producers exposed while others actively defend their national interests. This is why we will continue to use a full range of trade remedies available to us, including tariffs where justified, to ensure a level playing field, safeguard jobs, and maintain British sovereign capability to produce steel. I refer to Lord Billy-Murray's point about the India Free Trade Agreement. The Noble Lord will know that we are seeking to bring this deal into force as quickly as we possibly can. We are currently working with India to ensure all parties have taken all the necessary steps to bring the deal into force. And also, points raised by Lord Redwood, Baroness O'Grady, Lord Billy-Murray and Lord Fox regarding the green steel and the electric arc furnaces versus blast furnaces. The government is clear that the future of steel industry is green steel. Let me reassure the House that currently electric arc furnaces in the UK are making the full range of steels, from commodity construction grades through stainless steel and specialized steel for defense and nuclear industries. There are still challenges in certain areas, such as packaging steel, but we are confident that the industry will find the right solutions. If Noble Lords would find it helpful, I can arrange for a technical briefing on this point for those interested in this area. Several Noble Lords have asked about energy-intensive industry. The British Industry Supercharger seeks to address this crucial issue, providing targeted relief to qualifying sectors to improve competitiveness, safeguard manufacturing, and support decarbonisation objectives in the UK. From April 2026, the level of compensation offered by the Network Charging Compensation Scheme was increased from 60% to 90%. Reducing electricity network connection timescales is also a high priority for the government. We are working very closely with Ofgem, the electricity system operator, and network companies to accelerate network connections. My Lords, I think it's Lord Bellamore that asked the question about the transformation of British Steel, and also Lord Hunt and Lord Frost, and the future of British Steel under public ownership. The government's ambition is straightforward. We want British Steel to become a successful and sustainable British industrial champion that the entire country can be proud of. Should public ownership proceed, it would provide the opportunity to take a longer-term view and to put in place the leadership, governance and investment necessary to secure the company's future and safeguard domestic steel production. We believe there is every reason to be optimistic. British Steel continues to have highly skilled workers, valuable industrial assets and significant commercial opportunities. Recent contracts, as I mentioned in my opening speech, recent contract wins demonstrate that there remains strong demand for British Steel and that the company has an important role in the future of our economy. Several Lords asked questions on jobs. I fully understand those concerns. The government's objective is a sustainable steel capable of standing on its own 2 feet. That is the best guarantee for long-term employment and stability for workers and their families alike. The decisive action taken by the government last year prevented the immediate loss of approximately 2,700 jobs and ensured the continuation of steel production in Scunthorpe. We recognise that the sector is evolving and that future technologies will shape the future of steel making. That is why any transition must be managed carefully. It must support workers, protect communities and preserve our economic resilience. The government will continue to work closely with trade unions, employees and local stakeholders through the process. Noble Lords Weakley and Noble Lord Billy Morey and I think Noble Lord Murphy also asked about Port Talbot. The government has got no plans to acquire any other steel undertakings, but this bill provides flexibility to intervene if a future need arises and the public interest test is met. The government remains fully committed to securing the long-term future of steel making in Port Talbot through Tata Steel's $1.25 billion transition to a state-of-the-art electric arc furnace supported by the government up to £500 million of government funding. Baroness O'Grady and Lord Fox asked questions on EU. The global context has changed drastically since Brexit. We need a closer economic relationship that protects our collective industrial security. Both the UK and EU are taking measures to improve the security and resilience of key sectors. We both face the same challenges such as overcapacity and higher tariffs, which is distorting global markets. The historic UK-EU summit last year was the first of our annual summits that will take place to improve our diplomatic, economic and security cooperation following Brexit. The date of this year's summit will be announced in due course. Now, Noble Lord Fox, I think, did ask about the chilling effect on investment. Let me address this head-on. This bill does not create any chilling effect on investment. I can do no better than to quote my friend the Minister in the other place. We have carried out a very careful balance with this bill to ensure that the steel industry is fully informed, understands our intentions, and is supportive. And it is supportive. The bill is explicitly framed as a targeted last resort response to a market failure, which government signalling it is not intended for wider or frequent use, which narrows uncertainty to a specific context rather than the sector as a whole. Noble Lord Redwood asked about the environment liabilities, and rightfully so. Many environmental liabilities arise on closure. Government interventions is precisely about avoiding disorderly shutdown and managing safely the remediation respectively. My Lords, several Lords have also raised the issue of compensation. My Lords, the government is committed to respecting business rights and ensuring fair treatment. To be absolutely clear, the government's action to date at British Steel and any in the future are solely about commercial reality and about delivering our domestic steel strategy. They would not differ under any owner's nationality. If the transfer powers and bill are exercised, a compensation scheme would be established to consider and pay compensation for any losses suffered by those affected. An independent valuer will be appointed to oversee this process and determine what compensation, if any, is payable. There is nothing to prevent an outcome of nil compensation, but this would be a decision for the valuer and would depend on the circumstances. My Lords, let me address the issue of nationalisation. I think was mentioned by the Noble Baroness Noakes and Lord Sharp. Look, which opposes nationalism on principle, yet appears prepared to accept the loss of the United Kingdom's last remaining primary steel-making capability in the name of market purity. We believe in free markets, and no responsible government can stand aside when a strategically vital industry and national security are at risk. This is not ideology, it is pragmatism. Every major industrial nation supports its steel industry. The question is not whether governments intervene, but whether they are willing to act in the national interest where circumstances require it. Faced with a choice between preserving British steelmaking and watching it disappear, this government chose action. And the promise of privatization was that private ownership would deliver greater investment, stronger productivity, and better outcomes for consumers and taxpayers. Yet too often we have seen the opposite: underinvestment, short-term decision-making, and strategic national assets left vulnerable when market conditions turn difficult. The reality is that when privatization succeeds, profits are privatized. When it fails, losses are socialized. Working people lose their jobs, communities pay the price, and taxpayers are asked to step in. This is precisely why this government is prepared to act when a strategically important industry such as steel is at risk. When the national interest is at stake, standing aside is not a responsible option. I will commit to writing to Noble Baroness about the classification of the British steel debt. My officials will definitely write to her. And we will also provide annual reporting to Parliament on financial support, and that is provided under the Bill of Powers itself. I turn now to Port Talbot, as mentioned by several Lords. With regard to the fire at Port Talbot, the fire was successfully contained and all personnel are safe. We will continue to monitor the situation closely while investigations are ongoing and the company moves from emergency response to recovery planning. Regarding grid delays, timelines are still evolving and not yet finalized. We remain fully committed to securing the long-term future of steelmaking at Port Talbot and are working closely with all parties involved to identify mitigations and explore options to accelerate delivery. I think Noble Lord Seeker and Noble Lord Fox also asked a question about the importance of foreign investment and our relationship with China. I also wish to be clear that the government have decided to introduce this bill regardless of the nationality of the firm that owns British Steel, which obviously is Jinjay currently. The government continue to welcome Chinese investment in the UK and do not consider the situation at British Steel to reflect our wider relationship with investors. My Lords, British Steel is a strategic asset, as I said earlier, for the UK's steel production, critical in national infrastructure and local economy. Unfortunately, the government could not find a way to safeguard British Steel's operation under its current ownership. But while this government now needs to take steps to secure UK steel capability, we are committed to doing so in a way that respects the rights of business. My Lords, throughout this debate, one theme has recurred. The future of steel matters. It matters to our economy. It matters to our industrial base. It matters to our national security. And it matters to communities whose lives have been built around steelmaking for generations. The bill before your Lordship's House is not about preserving the past. I said in my opening, it is about securing the future. It is about securing that Britain retains the sovereign capability to produce steel. It is about creating the conditions for a modern, competitive and sustainable steel sector. And it is about demonstrating that when strategically important national capabilities are at stake, this government is prepared to act. Today, your Lordship have the opportunity to send a clear message, as I said earlier, to steelworkers, industry, investors and the country that Parliament remains committed to a long-term future of British steelmaking. My Lords, I'm very grateful to all noble Lords for the contributions and for the constructive spirit in which this debate has been conducted. I look forward to continuing those discussions as the bill progresses through the House. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, as many of that opinion shall say content. Contrary not content, the contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move the commitment motion standing in my name on the order paper.
The question is that the bill be committed to a committee of the whole House, as many of that opinion shall say content. Contrary not content, the contents have it. My Lords, perhaps this might be a convenient moment to... Combined Authorities Mayoral Elections Amendment Order 2026, Baroness Taylor of Stevenage.
My Lords, I beg to move that this House consider the draft Combined Authorities Mayoral Elections Amendment Order 2026, which was laid before the House on the 21st of May 2026. Over the course of the last year, Parliament has debated, agreed and decided that the voting system for mayors and police and crime commissioners should be changed to use the Supplementary Voting System, or SV, through the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act 2026, which received royal assent in April. I remember fondly the debates that peers had on the matter in this chamber during the passage of the Act. Therefore, I'm sure some of the points I will go on to set out in relation to SV will be very familiar to the peers who are in the chamber today. The SV system was used when the positions of elected mayors and police and crime commissioners were first established decades ago. The government believes it is the most appropriate voting system for single executive offices, where it is essential that the individual has a broad mandate from their electorate. The English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act contains the main measures required to change the voting system used for these types of elections, and these will be commenced in due course. However, there are also a number of other changes that must be made to the election conduct rules via secondary legislation to fully enable the use of SV. For example, updating the images of ballot papers to allow a voter to select multiple preferences, updating guidance to electors and updating the procedures used at the count should there be a second round of counting. As stated during the parliamentary passage of the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act, the government's intention was to implement the change to SV for any mayoral or PCC election taking place after the scheduled May elections this year. This order has been drafted to be concise and so will only make the necessary additional amendments to enable SV to be used for both combined authority and combined county authority mayors, including those that exercise police and crime commissioner powers. The order will therefore not make amendments with regards to local authority mayors, the Mayor of London or the Police and Crime Commissioner elections, and further legislation will be brought forward for those in due course. Turning to the timings for implementation, this order will make the change to SV for any combined authority or combined county authority mayoral election for which notice is given on or after the date that this order comes into force. I would also note that as this is a reversion to the original voting system used for mayoral elections, the SV process will be familiar to both administrators and electors. Implementing these changes will therefore be straightforward, and we are confident returning officers will be able to make the necessary changes. I turn now to the content of the instrument. The conduct rules for elections of combined authority and combined county authority mayors are set out in the Combined Authority Mayoral Elections Order 2017. This order will make a number of amendments to the 2017 order. As we have discussed already, the SV system was the system used when combined authority mayors were first established, so these changes are largely reverting the 2017 order back to its original drafting. The Electoral Commission has been formally consulted on these changes and has raised no objections. Articles 3, 4 and 5 of this instrument will amend Schedules 1, 2 and 3 to the 2017 order, respectively, which set out the conduct rules for these mayoral elections, both where the poll is a standalone poll and when the poll at a mayoral election is combined with the poll at another type of election or referendum. The amendments will update the guidance given to voters in polling stations to reflect that they now have the option to select a second preference. They will also update the various processes involved in counting the votes to reflect that a second round of counting may be required. They also make a number of consequential amendments throughout the conduct rules to ensure that references to votes refer to first and/or second preference votes as appropriate. Schedules 1 and 2 to this instrument contain updated statutory electoral forms. Schedule 1 sets out the forms in respect of a standalone mayoral election, and Schedule 2 sets out the forms where a mayoral election is combined with another type of election or referendum. There are two types of forms that require updating to enable SV. The first is the ballot paper. A new ballot paper image is provided in this instrument to allow voters to be able to select both a first and second preference of candidates. The instrument also contains the ballot paper to be used where there are only two candidates running, as in that scenario, voters are not given the choice to select a second preference and the poll reverts to a simple majority voting system. The second is the postal voting statement, and these contain guidance to postal voters, and so this instrument provides a new postal voting statement form that will inform the voter that they may select both a first and second preference where there are three or more candidates running. To conclude, these are straightforward changes necessary to implement a change set out in primary legislation in the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act. I hope the House will join me in supporting this instrument, and I look forward to answering any questions that members might have. I move.
My Lords, the question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, I thank the Minister for her introductory comments, and I shall return to one or two of the points that she made in a moment. I think it's worth being honest with everybody in relation to election changes, in that every party, when they make election law changes, they may hide it in one form or another, but actually over their shoulder they're looking at, well, how are we going to benefit from any particular change? And I think that's worth acknowledging. But in this particular case, it is striking the speed with which this order has been brought forward. And one has to ask the question, why on earth is it being brought forward at this stage? Particularly because, as the Minister said, she referred to the legislation which has just been passed, having received royal assent in April. And she also went on to say, further legislation will be brought forward for other matters in due course. Now, every single debate in which I have participated on election law in the last decade has included a request to simplify the whole process of elections law, not make it more complicated. There's been persistent reference to the Law Commission and their original report and further changes thereafter. What do we have here? An admission by the Minister that we are debating one thing this evening, but at some stage, unspecified, further legislation will be brought forward. Why? The answer is quite simple. Because the Labour Party has got itself in an almighty mess in the North West. There is a by-election in Makerfield on Thursday, and there is the possibility of a by-election for the Greater Manchester mayoralty thereafter. At a cost, probably, although the government refuses to identify the actual figure, but probably of around £5 million to solve their problems. That's the first issue. But let's be honest in relation to this particular order. It's not normal to identify who is going to be affected by any particular change of law. But let's be honest. This order is an attempt to stop Reform winning the possible Greater Manchester mayoralty by-election. It would be better titled, this order, the Combined Authorities Mayoral Elections Stop Reform Winning the Greater Manchester Mayoralty Order 2026, because that's what it simply comes down to. There is no other justification for the haste with which this order has been introduced other than solving Labour Party's problems and actually stopping the Reform Party from winning a mayoralty. And it really doesn't do British democracy well when the position is as blatant as just that, and nothing more and nothing less, because otherwise this order could have waited until we had all the different changes that were necessary being introduced in one go, at one time, in the very near future. My Lords, I want to comment just on one other element of this particular order, and that is the impact assessment. All changes in legislation have an impact, some smaller than others, and the Minister is right that we are reverting to a system which operated previously, and therefore there should be relatively small changes. But they are changes nonetheless. We've gone quite a few years since this system was introduced. There will be many polling station officers, returning officers, people who are asked to administer the whole process, who are actually new to this. There will be a necessary set of changes which result in training courses, as the Minister identified, notices will be different, understanding will be different. And I cannot believe that when this is introduced, the Electoral Commission will not expect to provide guidance to the voters of Greater Manchester as to how they will now vote as against how they did last time. So although the costs relatively, in terms of impact assessment, are small, I do think it isn't correct to say that there will be no or virtually no cost. I think it is appropriate that we should be told what the cost is, but I do actually think it's also appropriate that we should be told what the total cost of a Greater Manchester by-election is actually going to be as the Labour Party tries to get itself out of a mess of its own making.
My Lords, I concur 100% with the comments by my noble friend Lord Hayward. I am going to take this statutory instrument on its face value and discuss the issues that it raises with regard to the alternative vote and first past the post. As noble lords will know, when proportional representation was tested with the electorate in 2011, in this case the alternative vote referendum, it was lost by a margin of 68% to 32%. I think what is noteworthy in this document, in the statutory instrument, is the paucity of intellectual rationale for why the changes are happening. I agree with my noble friend. It looks like a cynical stitch-up to avoid embarrassment in the combined boroughs of Greater Manchester, but it also looks potentially like rolling out the strategy of a progressive alliance in the run-up to a general election with, for instance, the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats, with the stated aim, or probably the unstated aim, of locking out the Conservatives and Reform UK from power. First past the post is simple and fair, and Conservatives have always supported it. It ensures proper representation and broad campaigning by parties rather than targeting policies of a subset of voters. It's simple and transparent, and even in a disaggregated, fragmented political landscape, it's still stable and effective in terms of delivering governance One person secures a plurality of votes, and that's transparent. In fact, as it happens, almost 100 Labour MPs have been elected in the other place with less than 35% of the votes. So if it's good enough for this government's majority in the other place, then it's good enough generally for our elections. In fact, the Home Affairs Select Committee in 2016 recommended that first past the post was best to replace the supplementary vote in police and crime commissioner elections. SV causes confusion and leads to a lot of spoilt and rejected ballots, and the Electoral Commission in their report of September 21 of the 2021 elections noted, quote, a quarter of people who had difficulty filling in their ballot paper in areas holding local government and PCC elections said it was confusing that the elections used were under different voting systems. A third of people voting in London said that they found the two voting systems confusing. And in fact, the rejection rate in the London mayoralty election in 2021 was 114,201 ballots, of which 87,000 were because voters cast a vote for more than one candidate in the first preference column. 263,353 voters were invalidated because their second preference was cast for the same candidate as the first, and 319,978 second preferences were unmarked. In fact, these void rates exceeded the votes actually validly transferred to the two leading candidates. Mr. Khan, who got 192,000 votes, and Mr. Sean the Noble Lord Bailey of Paddington, who got 85,000 transfers. My Lords, first past the post focuses on clear accountability. Electors know the one individual who's responsible for the failings or the successes of public policy. SV gives a recycled second vote the same democratic credibility as voters' first choice. Each vote should count equally. One person, one vote. And in fact, a supplementary vote is used almost nowhere else across the globe. The late and much renowned and much missed elections expert and academic Professor David Butler described SV as, quote, a silly answer based on the need to compromise between rival factions, unquote. First past the post is quicker to count and cheaper to administer, as my noble friend has alluded to, and better understood by voters. And some very eminent people in your Lordship's House agree with this. In fact, one of them said, SV is one of the worst systems. We had a referendum in 2011 on changing the voting system for elections to the House of Commons. This was wholly rejected, and I've seen nothing following on from that result or anything that's happened subsequently which leads me to believe that the country wants to change the voting system for any elections, no any elections. We have managed to heap on voters a whole plethora of voting systems that is not a good thing to do. I thought that one of the worst systems was the SV system. I've observed many counts where people have put a cross in the second column, which means that their votes are discounted. Brilliantly said by the current Labour government chief whip. Quite, my lords. He said that in 2015. And indeed, the UCL Constitution Unit in 2021 described supplementary vote as, quote, an anomaly and out of step with other elections in England. At least AV, which is an alternative system, allows a more pluralistic preference voting. My lords, I want to ask the noble lady, the Minister, directly, will she confirm that these changes will take effect in respect of a putative Greater Manchester mayoral by-election, which may or may not happen later this year? My lords, this is about raw politics. It fails to make a coherent, fact-based intellectual case for reverting again to an SV regime. It is about locking out Reform UK and the Conservatives from power, and therefore it fails on merit, is a retrograde step which my party and myself oppose.
Oh, well, my lords, methinks the previous speakers on the Conservative benches do protest too much. First of all, I would remind the noble Lord Jackson that I believe that it was the Conservative government who introduced the use of the supplementary vote in the first place. So that puts that argument to one side. Secondly, the noble Lord Jackson's argument about the use of the first past the post gives us good results, clear results. Well, they may do, but on a very minority of the electorate. And we share this wonderful system with just one country in the world, Belarus. So maybe those aren't the sort of companion that we would really prefer. I certainly would rather a system that reflects the voting preferences of people rather than having, as the noble Lord Jackson said, something easy to count. So, my lords, the timing of this SI, as the noble Lord Hayward pointed out, is interesting and very helpful to the government. A by-election on Thursday, which may result in a vacancy for the Mayor of Greater Manchester. So here we are with an SI. The voting system for the combined authority mayors was, as I have said just now, initially by the supplementary vote. But this was abandoned by the Conservatives government in 2022, I think, in favour of the first past the post model. Now, the noble Lord Hayward was saying that cynically governments do this. They choose a voting place, so this will be better, more reflect the needs of the electorate, while looking over their shoulders to how the voters are going to actually choose who they vote for. And I suggest to him that maybe that's what happened in 2022. Though the outcome was not what the Conservative government hoped for, because in the mayoral elections that followed that change last year, the average turnout was 30%, and 2 of those mayors who were elected did so with less than 30% of that 30%. In other words, with less than 10% of the electorate supporting them. I do maths, I'm right. So, which illustrates the degree of voter apathy about whichever system that is used. So, at least with the supplementary vote, there is a bit of a better reflection of voter preferences, though the system is by no means perfect and as far as matching what voters want. It is at best a halfway house towards true electoral fairness, because voters are restricted, as we've heard, to 2 preferences, column A and column B. Now, I think it was the noble Lord Jackson who said that voters get confused by different voting systems. I'm going to ask him to go to Scotland to enjoy their voting system. Local government is by single transferable vote. The votes to the Scottish Parliament are by a 2 system. You have 2 votes, one for regional and one for a first past the post. And the regional is the regional to make more proportional. And then the third, of course, is by first past the post for the Westminster election. So if the people of Scotland have no trouble with that, the people of Ireland, Northern Ireland and Ireland have no trouble with STV. So I'm not sure why the noble Lord Jackson thinks people will be, in England, will be confused. So the argument against SV is that you limit the voters' preferences to just 2. And, you know, if you don't like either what's on offer, then if your second choice is not of one of the top 2 candidates, you have no say at all. So, because your vote is just discarded. So, in that sense, those voters are left out completely. Now, I have a question for Noble Baroness the Minister, because I have assumed that the SV vote will be counted so that the top 2 are taken forward to, if there's no majority on the first count, will be taken through to the second preferences and all other candidates eliminated. However, that's not what it says that I could find in the SI. It talks about, and I quote, referring to the candidates remaining in the contest, without actually identifying that that will be, as I'm assuming, the top 2. So perhaps the Baroness Minister can just, you know, help me understand if and what it's meant and why it's worded rather vaguely. Now, I know the Noble Lord Jackson doesn't like the alternative vote. Actually, neither do I really, because although it's more proportional than either first past the post or supplementary vote, it's not the best system to reflect what people want, and but it would be somewhat a bit better than using either first past the post or SV. So we support the order reluctantly because it moves us a bit further forward, gets rid of first past the post for at least one election that we have to use, and I do hope, I think it was the Noble Lord Hayward was suggesting this, that now we're in a multi-party situation, and we're often in elections there are going to be candidates from at least 5 parties, and in the recent local elections where I live there were sometimes 6 and 7 in several wards, 7 candidates, and in that instance people could get elected on 20% or less of the vote. So that makes it more of a lottery than it ought to be, and does not reflect what voters really want, and is not good for democracy actually, because it's only 7 seconds there. Giving me the eye. So just because I've gone 13 seconds over the time. So democracy depends on the electorate having trust and faith in the system. And if we don't have trust and faith in the system, that's when democracy is in peril. So a big change to the electoral system would be good, but I'll go with this one.
My Lords, before I speak, I'm not sure it is a conflict in this issue, but I do need to declare that I'm a councillor in Central Bedfordshire. And I thank Noble Lords for speaking on this debate. I thank the Noble Baroness Pinnock, who I think at the end of her debate said she was in favour of the single transferable minutes from one speaker to the next speaker to allow her to speak longer. But can I thank my noble friend Lord Hayward, who has raised the very important question of why now, and I will come to that later, and Lord Jackson, who has given an excellent exposition of the shortcomings of the transferable vote system, or the supplementary vote system. Now, this is in essence a reversal. Within a relatively short period of time, we have moved from supplementary vote to first past the post, and now back to supplementary votes for mayoral elections. Whatever the view one takes of the retrospective systems, that degree of oscillation is not a strength of constitutional design. And I ask the very simple question, what problem is this change actually seeking to solve? The government's answer appears to be that the claim supplementary vote system produces a mayor with broader support and therefore greater legitimacy. It's also said to allow voters to express preferences more fully and to ensure that votes are not wasted, though as my noble friend Lord Jackson pointed out, in the previous London mayoral election there seemed to be quite an awful lot of wasted supplementary votes. Now, these arguments are familiar. They have been advanced in favour of preferential systems for many years, but repetition is not justification. The reality is that this draft does not demonstrate a failure in the existing arrangements of first past the post, nor does it set out evidence that voter confidence in mayoral elections has been undermined by the current system. Instead, it simply asserts that the alternative system is preferable. My Lords, that is not sufficient when what is at issue is the rules by which democratic office is secured. First past the post has one defining virtue, and that is clarity. The candidate with the most votes wins. There's no second count, no transfer of preferences, no recalculation. The result is immediate and intelligible. As my noble friend Lord Jackson of Peterborough has pointed out, the public has previously demonstrated that they have a preference for the first past the post system. And that matters more than members may realise, because the electoral system does not exist just in theory. It exists in the mind of the voter at the ballot box. If the voter does not really understand how their vote translates into outcome, we risk something important being lost. The supplementary vote system is not incomprehensible, but it is more complex. It does introduce a second stage of allocation, where preferences are redistributed. That may be administratively manageable, but it's not straightforward, it's not intuitive. My Lords, we must remember that confidence in our elections is essential. The government also argue the system produces a more legitimate mandate because it takes account of second preferences. My Lords, that's a fundamentally different conception of legitimacy, and it's not a neutral change. Under first past the post, legitimacy comes from a clear view expressed at the ballot box. Under supplementary vote, it comes from aggregated preferences after elimination and redistribution. Those are different constitutional logics. First past the post is well understood, it's tried, it's tested, it's clear. The question for this House is which is more appropriate for mayoral elections in England today. We are not persuaded that the government has made a strong enough case that change is required. There is also the wider concern of uncertainty caused by frequent changes. That cannot be ignored. Electoral arrangements should not shift back and forth with such frequency. Voters, candidates, administrators require stability. They need to know that the rules they are voting under today will be the same at the next election. At present, that confidence is weakened by repeated changes. I should therefore be grateful if the Minister could address a straightforward point. What is the government's principle here? Is it that electoral systems should be treated as settled constitutional arrangements unless there is clear and compelling evidence of failure? Or is it that they may be altered whenever the government takes a different view? Because those are very different approaches. There's also the question of practice. The instrument requires changes to ballot papers, guidance to returning officers, counting procedures, voter information, administrative systems across combined authorities. Now, all of that is manageable, but it's not without its cost, without its friction, and its implications for time. As my noble friend Lord Hayward has raised, I also ask the question, why now? Why the urgency? Putting this in place will take some time for electoral returning officers. Yet there is a risk we shall very shortly have a mayoral by-election. Would it not be better to delay to ensure a smoother implementation and also to include those other potential future changes? As my noble friend asked, why now? And I also ask, why now? What assessment has been made of the costs to local authorities of implementing this change? What additional burdens will fall on electoral administrators? And what steps will be taken to ensure consistency of understanding across different areas in the run-up to elections? And more importantly, what assessment has been made of voter understanding? It's often assumed in this debate that voters are closely engaged with the mechanics of electoral systems, but my personal experience is they're not that closely engaged. In fact, sometimes they're not that closely engaged in the detailed minutiae of politics. So I think that is a stretch assumption. What matters to voters is that the process is clear at the point of voting and that the outcome is trusted. And trust depends on simplicity, familiarity, and both are weakened by this system change repeatedly. My Lords, none of this requires us to resolve once and for all the philosophical debate between electoral systems. Reasonable people will differ on that question. But what the House is being asked to approve is not an abstract principle. It's a concrete change to the machinery of elections, justified on the basis of asserted improvements in legitimacy. We, on this side of the House, are not persuaded that the case has been made. We're not convinced that the benefits outweigh the costs to clarity, stability and confidence, and we're concerned about the wider pattern of repeated alterations to electoral arrangements, and we're also concerned about why now. For those reasons, while I do look forward to the Minister's response, I must indicate that we remain unconvinced by the necessity or wisdom of this statutory instrument.
Excellent. My Lords, I thank all noble Lords for their considered contributions today, and if I can pick up first of all Lord Jamison's point about the principle behind this, because I think that's the most important thing. That I did set it out in my introduction speech, and that's that government believes this is the most appropriate voting system for single executive offices where it's essential that an individual has a broad mandate. So having cleared that point of principle up, I will try and answer all of noble Lord's questions. First of all, the noble Lord Hayward asked me about is the reason for delivering this change at pace for political advantage? Well, the answer to that is clearly no. As I've already said, the government was very clear during the passage of the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act that we intended to make this change for mayoral and PCC elections after May 2026. There is now the potential for such an election. I'll come on to more about that in a moment. And we therefore are now acting to deliver on our commitments made to Parliament. Just in respect to the noble Lord Jackson, who raised these issues as well, and I'm sorry that the charm offensive that I experienced yesterday has come to a shuddering halt, but never mind. And he referred to locking Conservatives out from power. I think they did a very good job of that themselves, so I think that was clear. Lord Hayward asked me about the cost of any by-election in Manchester. I will, if he doesn't mind, I'll write to him on that issue. But it is paid for, of course, by the local authority, not from central taxation. However, in the general course of things, when these elections are held, of course, the election would be held anyway. When it's not a by-election, they would be held anyway. Ballot papers have to be printed anyway. The count has to be held anyway. So those costs are very similar, whether it's held under SV or whether it's held under the first past the post.
Thank the Minister for giving way, and I'm very pleased indeed of her commitment to write to me. Can I just ask, in association with that, Lord Jameson made reference to the associated costs of introducing this process. Could we possibly have both at the same time, please?
I will have a look whether it's possible to get that figure, so thank you for your question. Noble Lord Hayward and the Noble Lord Jamieson asked me about why we're only changing the voting system for two types of mayoral elections. First of all, can I reiterate that these changes do, as I think the Noble Baroness Pinnock referred to, they revert to the 2017 voting system, which was brought in by the Conservatives, and it was the Conservatives who changed it back in 2022. We are reverting back to the system that the Conservatives had introduced for these single office posts. And I've set out already the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act received royal assent in April this year, and the government's stated aim has always been we will work at pace to deliver secondary legislation needed to implement the new law at the earliest appropriate opportunity. Of course, the government's conscious there is now a possible scenario in which a mayoral by-election may need to be held in Greater Manchester in the coming months. subject to the outcome of a parliamentary by-election in the Makerfield constituency on Thursday this week. To fulfil both Parliament's will and this government's stated commitment to re-implement SV, we have drafted this order at pace to ensure that the necessary legislation will be in place for this system to be utilised if this by-election takes place. To meet this deadline, the order had to be kept concise and could not include measures to amend all other types of mayoral elections. Amending all the relevant mayoral and PCC election conduct rules would also require a range of statutory instruments as they use different parliamentary procedures. So we intend to implement SV for other mayoralties and PCCs in due course through separate instruments.
The Minister.
So if the Noble Lord will bear with me for a moment, because I'm just going to come on and answer some of his other points. So if I don't cover it, please do step in. Lord Jackson, the Noble Lord Jackson raised issues about the voting system. I'm sure he'll make his comments on voting in London when we make the instrument for London mayoral elections. But just to be very clear, this particular instrument does not cover the London mayoral elections. And I think SV was the voting system implemented on the introduction of both mayoral and police crime commissioner elections. We think, as I said, is much more appropriate for selecting single-person executive positions, such as mayors or police and crime commissioners. However, and the Noble Lord Jamieson did ask about this, we believe that first-past-the-post system is a clear way of electing representatives, which is well understood by voters, and while not perfect, provides for a direct relationship between a member of a legislature and the local constituency. The first-past-the-post voting system is therefore a more suitable system where there are a number of seats to be filled, such as for a council or a parliament, and the likelihood is that people representing a range of views and parties will be elected. Therefore, government has no plans to change the electoral system for UK parliamentary or local council elections in England.
Thank the Noble Lady, the Minister. On a point of fact, as a result of the 2022 legislation, which reverted back to first past the post, the Greater London Returning Officer estimated that because it was not necessary to use the e-voting infrastructure for counting, that there was an indicative saving of £4 million. So that is the difference between the AV and SV system, or the ASV system, and first past the post. So surely the Minister will concede that there is a significant greater cost of this new system that we don't yet know.
Well, as I said, this instrument doesn't cover London, and of course there's no price to put on democracy. We should be aiming for democracy always first. However, as I said to the Noble Lord Hayward, I will do my best to find out if there is any financial impact of this instrument. The Noble Lord Hayward asked me about the sector being able to cope with the late change, and SV has been used in the past extensively and recently and will be deeply familiar to returning officers and their teams. And my department has been working very closely with the sector as they prepare for the changes arising from the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act, and will continue to support them in managing any changes once this instrument was made. And as I said, we did consult with the Electoral Commission and they didn't have any concerns about this. So we're confident the change is straightforward and the sector will have no issues in implementing it. The Noble Lord Hayward and the Noble Baroness Pinnock, I think for very different reasons, but asked me about the public being informed about these changes, and the Noble Lord Jamieson, I think, had some concerns in that area too. Electors will receive information on the voting system used via a number of methods, including guidance on postal voting statements in polling stations that they will read prior to voting. More importantly, where there are 3 or more candidates at an election, the ballot paper itself will be clear that they have the option to select a second preference. I'm confident that electors will be informed of the change and understand their options when casting their vote, especially given that this is a voting system that has been used extensively in the past and will be well understood and indeed familiar to many voters. In Greater Manchester, they'd used SV for almost all its elections with the exception of one in 2024, reflecting its status as an established voting system. The Noble Lord Jackson and the Noble Baroness Pinnock, again, I expect for very different reasons, asked me about why using SV and not a different system. And the government has no plans at present to introduce alternative single transferable vote to mayoral and PCC elections. The government acknowledges that different voting systems can be better suited to different types of polls and elections, and we take the view that SV is the right system to use for selecting single-person executive positions. It requires the winning candidate to receive the majority of votes counted, and that makes sure that they've got a broad support across the area and a broader mandate from the people they're representing. And a key advantage of the SV system over other preferential voting systems is that this was the system, as I said, widely used for mayors and PCCs before, so people are familiar with that system. And the other question I had was from the Noble Baroness Pinnock around how the supplementary vote is counted. With a supplementary vote, if no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, the top two candidates continue to a runoff, and all other candidates are eliminated. When casting their ballot, voters can put a second choice, who they would vote for in a runoff, on the original ballot paper. If your favourite candidate gets through, your vote is counted for them in the runoff. If they didn't, but your second choice did, your vote goes to them. The runoff candidate with the most votes is declared the winner.
Sorry to interrupt, Noble Baroness and Minister, but the question I asked was that in the order, it does not say the top two. It just says the remaining candidates without defining what that should mean. I assumed, as you have assumed, that it is the top two, but I couldn't find that in the order. It just said the remaining candidates. Perhaps write to me.
To write to the Noble Lady to clarify that point. In conclusion, the instrument is necessary to allow the SV system to be implemented for combined authority and combined county authority mayoral elections. This was a commitment made in primary legislation, and it will ensure that those elected to these positions have a broad base of support from their electorates, which we believe is of particular importance for these single executive offices. I hope the committee will welcome these regulations, and I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.